Chapter 2182. The incarnation level was one of the billions of levels. This level was extremely strange. Everything in it was in an indescribable state. At first glance, it seemed to be similar to the real level. Even what existed in the real level could be found here. However, as long as one understood the essence of this level, one would know that everything in this level, including all things in the world, all living beings in the universe, heaven and earth, the heavenly Tao, and even the various invisible and intangible existences, were actually incarnations. Moreover, the incarnations of all things in the world were all things in the world. They looked almost no different from the various existences in the real level. However, the incarnations of living beings were completely different, because this was an existence of another level. The incarnations of living beings were actually different from the living beings in the real level. Unless one could completely control the corresponding incarnation in this level, the incarnation would be like a walking corpse that could only wander around in this world. There was no communication, no battle, no gratitude or grudges, no love or hate. Apart from the various things that would naturally make sounds, there was no sound in this level of incarnation. Moreover, because it was an entire level, the macroscopic state here was also greatly different from the real level. At a glance, even the incarnations of chaos could be found here. At that time, the incarnations of heaven and earth could be seen. However, their composition wasn't according to their respective natures. For example, the state of chaos could assimilate everything, derive everything, and destroy everything. For example, the state of chaos could be an eternal existence without tribulations and immeasurable in the state of chaos. For example, the various laws of heaven and earth, the various powers, the relationships between various living beings, and so on. The way they were composed was completely according to the state of various things in the real level. In other words, these incarnations, even if they were the incarnations of heaven and earth or the incarnations of chaos, were actually almost independent here. And this independence caused all kinds of awkwardness and even chaos to appear on a macroscopic level. For example, in the real level, the state of chaos was constantly oppressing and assimilating heaven and earth. However, in this level of incarnation, the two didn't have such a relationship of oppression and resistance at all. It was almost like two models placed together. Moreover, in the world, the incarnations of heaven and earth changed according to the changes in the real level without the use of any power. As for the living beings within, they naturally collapsed, dissipated, and turned into dust without any external forces acting on them. All these changes were completely in accordance with the rules of the various existences on the other planes. In other words, after a change occurred in the plane of reality, it did not change on the spot, but slowly moved towards that result as time passed. At this time, Luo Fan directly grabbed the heavenly Tao's incarnation and threw it into the incarnation plane. This incarnation level was the level that Luo Fan had been communicating with for hundreds of billions of years. In other words, to him, he could already completely control the avatar that corresponded to him in this avatar plane. He could even completely integrate the power of his main body into this avatar plane. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone, who was floating in the void, suddenly woke up from his daze. With a wave of his hand, he grabbed the Heavenly Law's clone that was floating in front of him. At this moment, the Tiandao clone shook slightly, and his originally dazed eyes began to become clear. Then, the boundless heavenly Tao behind him began to quickly converge on the incarnation, causing it to grow crazily and continuously strengthen. In the blink of an eye, it had already strengthened to more than hundreds of millions of times its original size. Its existence alone had already shaken the entire world and the boundless state of chaos in the outside world. Even if it was a world in the midst of tribulations, since it was a world that existed, it would inevitably reach the state of chaos in the end if it continued to trace outwards. As for the tribulation void in the middle, the level of the Tao Master's path, and the big world, these were all in the middle state. In this incarnation plane, it was actually at the same level as the original world itself and the state of chaos. If one did not care about it, they would naturally not exist. As the heavenly Tao collapsed and gathered towards the avatar, the network that originally covered the heavenly Tao and connected the avatar of the heavenly Tao in the avatar plane with the existences corresponding to the heavenly Tao in the other planes was instantly severed. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because although the incarnation in the real world was condensed by the heavenly Tao, it was already naturally possible to enter the incarnation plane because it was an incarnation. Under such circumstances, when Luo Fan, through the incarnation condensed by the heavenly Tao into the incarnation plane, it naturally merged with the incarnation of the heavenly Tao in the incarnation plane. And obviously, in this incarnation plane, there were two incarnations of the heavenly Tao. One was the incarnation of the incarnation in the real world, and the other was the incarnation of the heavenly Tao itself in the real world. These two incarnations had now merged with the incarnation that had been forcibly pressed into the incarnation plane by Luo Fan, forming to a certain extent the result of the fusion of the three. And the fusion of the three ultimately changed the connection between the incarnation of the heavenly Tao and the corresponding existences of the heavenly Tao in the other planes. In the end, the incarnation of the heavenly Tao was expelled from the entire network, resulting in the current situation. However, this was clearly only temporary. After all, it was the heavenly Tao. When it understood what had happened and understood the source of the situation, it would naturally react and think of a way to bring the incarnation back into the network. However, even if it was temporary, it was already enough for Luo Fan. For existences at their level, every instant was equivalent to countless years, and the attack that they could launch in every instant was equivalent to the attack that ordinary cultivators could launch in billions of years. Under such circumstances, as long as he could pull the incarnation out of the network, no matter how long it took, it would be enough for Luo Fan to use whatever power he wanted at this moment. He raised his hand and swatted at the incarnation of the heavenly Tao without any hesitation. Although the incarnation of the heavenly Tao was billions of times stronger than before, because it had merged with the incarnation of the heavenly Tao, it was as if Luo Fan had completely abandoned all his defenses. In his hands, it was more fragile than ever before. At this moment, his slap instantly condensed the terrifying might of the endless mysterious power that he had mastered. He even used the arbitration court to condense all the power and might in the world that he could condense, and he brazenly swatted at the incarnation plane of the heavenly Tao. With this slap, an endless amount of power appeared out of nowhere and gathered on the terrifying might of the slap, causing the power to increase by thousands of times after it left his hand. By the time it arrived before the heavenly Tao, its essence had already been enhanced by who knew how many billions of times. It had reached the point where just its existence alone was enough to shake the entire world, causing the incarnation of the entire world to continuously collapse, as if it was about to turn into countless fragments. If it was in the real world, the world itself would naturally produce a huge resistance to resist this kind of splitting and collapse. Even the arbitration court would naturally take action. The rules that covered the entire world and guarded the bottom line of the world would be triggered, directly eliminating most of the effects of the power that caused the world to collapse, thus preventing the world from truly collapsing in the process. However, it was obvious that this would only happen in the real world. In the incarnation plane, everything was independent, and all changes followed the changes in the real world. If there was no movement in the real world, there would be no movement here either. And the arbitration court in the real world obviously could not extend its power to the incarnation plane. In other words, there was no power that could stop this world from collapsing. Along with this change, the world collapsed the moment Luo Fan's palm came into contact with the heavenly Tao's incarnation. Endless, terrifying power began to spread from the point of contact, shattering the world into countless fragments that scattered in all directions. However, this was the incarnation plane, after all. Even if this kind of change in the real world could completely destroy the world and all living beings in it, it would still cause the world to collapse. In the end, the only result was that the avatars of many living beings were sent flying. There were very, very few who actually died from this transformation. As for the chaotic state of the outside world, it was like flowing water that flowed down and filled the space between the fragments. It had no effect on the erosion and assimilation of the fragments. At this moment, the result of the collision between the two was finally revealed. At this moment, the heavenly Tao's body trembled violently, and endless terrifying power erupted from the point of contact. Endless, terrifying booms were released from the heavenly Tao's body without reservation. Terrifying shock waves battered the surrounding space-time, battering against the clone that had infiltrated from the outside world and was in a state of primal chaos. Endless space-time, endless heaven and earth, and endless light and shadow were born from the impact and quickly disappeared without a trace. After all, the heavenly Tao's incarnation wasn't ordinary. Even though it suffered an attack from Luo Fan's endless layers of attacks due to a moment of carelessness, it had already returned to its senses and began to adopt a brand new response. Its expression was still indifferent, calm, and even calm. Then, he raised his hand and drew a line in the air. Heaven and earth instantly flipped, and the entire heaven and earth incarnation condensed back into one. The scattered living beings returned to their original positions, and the chaos incarnation that had infiltrated and was sent back, circling outside the heaven and earth. Then, it raised its hand and grabbed at Luo Fan. With this grab, the world turned upside down, and an endless and terrifying power crazily rushed towards Luo Fan like an irresistible wave. Amidst these waves, Luo Fan felt as if he had turned into a fallen leaf. He felt as if he was about to be swallowed up by the void along with the waves. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a soft cry and raised his hand to grab at the void. The world instantly returned to its original state. After all, he was an existence that had comprehended the realm of the incarnation for hundreds of billions of years. His control of this realm and the use of power in this realm had long reached an unimaginable level. At this moment, he directly manipulated the endless clones and gathered the endless power of the world. He even controlled the arbitration court and even faintly seeped his power into the chaotic state of the clone, guiding the chaotic state of the endless power to condense into one. His grab seemed simple, but it had already used all of his wisdom and power to the limit. As the world became clear again, he did not stop moving. In a flash, he had already arrived before the heavenly way. He raised his hand and poked at the void. Endless power turned into all kinds of strange lights and shadows that pounced on the heavenly way's incarnation. The lights and shadows kept growing and strengthening in the void. In the blink of an eye, they had already strengthened by hundreds of millions of times. At this moment, the heavenly way also reacted. It raised its hand and grabbed at the void. Endless lights and shadows appeared in front of it and blocked the endless lights and shadows released by Luo Fan. At the same time, faint traces of a network were forming in the void and gradually spreading towards the heavenly way's incarnation. It seemed like it wanted to bring the heavenly way's incarnation into a certain network again. Obviously, this was the huge network that covered all levels and connected the corresponding existences of the heavenly way in all levels. At this moment, Luo Fan knew that he did not have much time left. At this moment, his eyes narrowed and he let out a soft cry. In that instant, in the real world, the Guardian platform formed by over 10 million Guardian platforms under Shu Xi's feet shuddered and exploded with a bang. Endless power and might surged into the sky in that instant, disappearing into the void. As it suddenly exploded, the entire world in the real world shook violently. Even the arbitration judge, who was under Luo Fan's control, trembled slightly. As for the arbitration court behind the arbitration judge, it began to shake violently. Cracks constantly appeared on the arbitration court, making it look like it was completely glued together by countless fragments. Of course, in contrast, the heavenly way also began to show a pained expression at this moment. His river-like figure began to sway slightly, and faint specks of light scattered and disappeared from this world. As for the world itself, the areas that had lost the guardian platforms were like rootless trees, shaking more intensely than anything else in this world. This included the world itself and the heavenly way. Vaguely, the tens of millions of regions that were originally connected together began to gradually collapse and slowly dissipate. At this moment, a sigh rang out from the heavenly way. Endless power gathered in these regions out of nowhere, gathering in the space that was clearly missing a huge hole. Gradually, it began to condense into platforms. As these platforms reformed, the areas that were about to completely collapse stabilized. Of course, even though it had stabilized once more, it was still shaking. It was just that the frequency and magnitude of the shaking was much smaller than before. It was vaguely similar to the shaking of the entire world and the heavenly Tao itself. Under this change, the cracks in the arbitration court began to heal. The arbitration judge also began to stop shaking, and his expression became a lot more relaxed. Sure enough, you're just the heavenly way. Although you have fused with him and gained the intelligence of some living creatures, the nature of the heavenly Tao still has a huge restriction on you, making you unable to do as you please. In the real world, Luo Fan spoke in a flat tone. In response to those words, the heavenly Tao that was like a stream of light above did not respond. It continued to pour down light and energy that gathered in the tens of millions of regions, forming the platform and stabilizing those regions so that they wouldn't collapse. Compared to the billions of areas in this world, the tens of millions of areas weren't a lot. However, it was definitely not a small amount. If these tens of millions of areas suddenly collapsed and were destroyed at the same time, then no matter how vast the world was, even if it didn't completely collapse due to its great foundation, it would definitely suffer a great loss of vitality. A large portion of the world would become chaotic as a result. This kind of chaos would definitely expand like a malignant tumor, and in the end, it would affect the operation of the heavenly Tao itself. It would even affect the endurance of the entire world, affect the stability of the entire world, and make it extremely likely that the world would directly collapse under the impact that came next. Chapter 2183. It would be fine if this weakness wasn't discovered by the opponent, but once it was discovered, it would be fatal. Just like at this moment, what Luo Fan was doing was targeting the weakness of the heavenly Tao. It must be said that without the confidence to transcend this world, it was impossible for him to sit by and watch the world be destroyed. After all, if the world was destroyed, it was very likely that he would be destroyed along with it. Under such circumstances, he purposely destroyed the world without any regard for its ability to withstand. Clearly, he wanted to force the heavenly Tao to split some of its power to protect the world and maintain its integrity. After all, as long as the heavenly Tao split some of its power and didn't wholeheartedly fight against him, then he would gain a huge advantage. As for the heavenly Tao, it actually didn't have the intelligence of a real living being. To it, the goal of its existence had long been set there. Even if it knew that Luo Fan was only forcing it to split some of its power, it had no choice but to take action and split some of its power when it saw the possibility of the world collapsing. In other words, Luo Fan's actions could be considered an overt plot. At this moment, the boundless mysterious power released by the collapse of the tens of millions of guardian platforms condensed into the shape of a cannonball. It brazenly broke through the barrier between reality and the embodiment level and charged into the embodiment level, charging towards the heavenly Tao's embodiment. As it charged, the embodiment level seemed to be unable to withstand the power and began to violently tremble. The embodiment of the world vaguely showed signs of collapsing again, as the power continuously charged towards the heavenly Tao's embodiment. Indescribable power continuously gathered from various levels and continuously fused with the power in the embodiment level, causing the power's effect to double. By the time it arrived before the heavenly Tao's embodiment, the power's effect had soared by hundreds of millions of times. As Luo Fan's previous attacks struck the heavenly Tao's embodiment one after another, in that instant, the heavenly Tao incarnation began to tremble violently. Boundless power was released from its body, and all sorts of indescribable might swept out in all directions. Powerful shockwaves were constantly released, and it used all sorts of indescribable methods to resist the shockwaves and eliminate the effects of the shockwaves on its body. Unfortunately, all of this came to nothing in the end. In the end, the Heavens Tao avatar collapsed into countless fragments before the web could envelop it once more. The reason why it collapsed so easily was because a large portion of the heavenly Tao's power was being used to maintain the integrity of the world in the real world. Although the power left in the incarnation level was extremely terrifying, it still had a flaw. Under Luo Fan's attack, this flaw was instantly torn apart, causing the entire heavenly Tao incarnation to collapse and be destroyed. As the heavenly Tao incarnation crumbled into countless fragments, the network that was spreading from the void and trying to absorb the heavenly Tao incarnation once again began to shrink. Although this network was mysterious and could link all the layers together, causing an attack on one layer to be transmitted to many layers, greatly reducing the effect of the attack and making it no longer a threat to the heavenly Tao. However, that was only possible if there was an existence corresponding to the heavenly Tao at that level. At this moment, the existence corresponding to the heavenly Tao in the incarnation level had completely collapsed and turned into countless fragments. Although it still had no choice but to exist, its state had changed greatly compared to before, and it was no different from not existing at all. Only by waiting for the heavenly Tao to perform a deduction and accept the state of the heavenly Tao in the incarnation level would it be possible to incorporate it into the network again. In other words, it would take a certain amount of time before it could be done. Just like how Luo Fan forcibly merged the heavenly Tao incarnation in the incarnation level and the incarnation in the real world, after which the heavenly Tao incarnation broke away from the network. Moreover, compared to when the heavenly Tao incarnation broke away from the network, the complete collapse of the heavenly Tao incarnation now had a greater change in the nature of the heavenly Tao. It would be more difficult to complete the deduction and incorporate it into the network again, which meant that it would take a longer time. In this way, Luo Fan was given more time to prepare. At this moment, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all, nor did he think that the heavenly Tao had ended after turning into countless fragments. It must be known that this was the heavenly Tao, a heavenly Tao that was much higher than him in essence. Even if he were to collapse into so many fragments, he would still be fine, let alone such a heavenly Tao. At this moment, with a thought, waves of power blasted towards the void and the fragments of the heavenly Tao. The power was mysterious and wonderful. In the void, it had already stirred up the barrier of the incarnation level, causing the incarnation level to distort continuously. In the end, the power blasted directly on the fragments of the heavenly Tao almost without passing through time. The distortions of the barrier enveloped the fragments of the heavenly Tao, causing them to become blurry. In the end, in a flash, they completely disappeared without a trace. At the same time, Luo Fan's face turned slightly pale, and his aura began to decline rapidly, as if the action just now had caused incredible damage to him. Opening so many layers at the same time is still beyond my ability after all. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind. As soon as he thought of this, his incarnation level shook and instantly exploded. Moreover, it wasn't just one explosion, but again and again, wave after wave, layer after layer of explosions. In other words, after he exploded the first time, the fragments would explode again, and then the fragments would explode again, and so on without an end. Although it was only a body, it took several days and billions of times for it to calm down. At this point, his body had already disappeared without a trace, as if he had already died. At the same time, his body in the real world also started to explode, layer by layer, layer by layer, layer by layer. In the end, after a few days, he directly exploded into countless fragments, as if his body had never appeared. The moment his body exploded, the heavenly Tao in the real world also began to churn violently. Above it, there were countless shadows of a network flashing, as if there were countless cracks wrapping around it. After these shadows of the network appeared, they did not simply wrap around the heavenly Tao. Instead, they kept breaking and shattering. It felt like there was some kind of power stirring the network and tearing it apart. As the heavenly Tao changed, the entire world also started to change violently. It felt like there was some kind of terrifying power constantly stirring the world, causing it to fall into chaos. It made all the living beings feel an indescribable fear at this moment. They felt as if their lives had fallen into a precarious situation. This change even made all the living beings lose their perception of time. They felt as if they had fallen into a state where time did not flow. It felt like billions of years had passed, but it also felt like only an instant had passed before the world gradually recovered. At this moment, several days had already passed for Luo Fan. The process of his body continuously exploding had also calmed down. His entire body, at least in the real world and in the incarnation realm, had completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. At this moment, before all the living beings could react, the void distorted and Luo Fan's figure slowly walked out of the void. He reappeared in the real world and in the incarnation realm. He looked completely the same as before. It was impossible to tell that he had disappeared once. That was close. Fortunately, all the impact was transferred to the real world and the incarnation realm. Otherwise, if every realm was damaged, it would really be difficult to recover. After recovering, Luo Fan had a somewhat relieved expression on his face. A few days ago, what he did to the heavenly Tao fragment was not just to send it away from the incarnation realm. Instead, he also opened the barriers of the countless realms that he had communicated with and directly sent every heavenly Tao fragment to a different realm. In other words, with the help of the barriers between the various realms, he had completely isolated the heavenly Tao fragment and fundamentally cut off the possibility of the heavenly Tao fragment gathering again. However, at that time, he had overestimated his strength. Opening the barriers of the realms was not very difficult for him. Even if he had to open the barriers of so many realms at the same time, it would only be a little strenuous for him. However, to send so many fragments of the heavenly Tao in so many planes at the same time, this was already beyond the limits of his strength. It should be known that every heavenly Tao fragment could actually be considered a small heavenly Tao. Even if it had completely collapsed, its power could definitely not be underestimated. In fact, it was not that much weaker than him. Moreover, as a heavenly Tao fragment in the incarnation realm, its own characteristics were fundamentally different from the other realms. Under normal circumstances, it would not even be possible for them to enter other realms. In this way, if Luo Fan wanted to send the heavenly Tao fragment into the various realms, it would be equivalent to sending a powerhouse who was not much weaker than him into a place that strongly rejected him. The difficulty was so great that it was thousands of times greater than simply opening the barriers of the various realms. It was precisely because he had underestimated the difficulty that Luo Fan had no choice but to use power that exceeded his limits in order to forcefully send them in. This was because he had already broken through the barrier between the various planes and the real world, and he was able to communicate with the various planes. If it was not for the fact that he could already communicate with the various realms at his will, mind, and power, it would have been impossible for him to achieve this even if he was willing to pay such a great price. However, even so, what he paid in the end was the backlash of the power that exceeded his limits. If it was not for his quick reaction and transferring the backlash to his body in the real world and the incarnation realm, the backlash would have definitely affected the existences corresponding to each of his realms. Once that happened, the existences corresponding to each of his realms would definitely be damaged at the same time. They might even completely collapse and be destroyed. At that time, it would be true death for him. After all, for the current Luo Fan, as long as the existences corresponding to him in any of the realms that he could communicate with the real world were still intact, then even if the existences among the billions of realms collapsed and were destroyed, he could still instantly condense a new body and completely restore them to the state before they perished. In this way, it did not matter to him how great the losses of a single realm were. However, once the losses spread to every other realm, it would be fatal. After sighing with emotion in his heart, Luo Fan instantly shifted his gaze to the heavenly Tao above. At that moment, the heavenly Tao was still in an inexplicable state of chaos. The phantom image of the network that appeared above, it was still appearing and collapsing at every moment. I didn't expect such an unexpected gain. Looks like I've won this time. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind when he saw this scene. With this thought, his body flashed, and he raised his hand to throw a punch at the heavenly Tao. In that instant, boundless might, boundless terror, and limitless power gathered crazily towards his fist. It could be said that this punch had condensed all the power he could control. Whether it was the concept God art, the mysteries of the heavenly Tao that he had comprehended in this world, or the various mysteries of the various realms that he could obtain and understand. It could be said that this punch had even surpassed any of the palm strikes he had thrown at the heavenly Tao before. It had even surpassed any of the attacks he had thrown after stepping onto the path of cultivation in his life. At this moment, such a punch was still continuously gathering the effects of the power that had spread to every realm. It looked as if there were more and more phantoms stacked on top of the fist, causing the fist to become more and more illusory and powerful. It also caused the surrounding space-time, endless laws, and even the entire world to shake under this punch. There were even endless cracks and endless shattering that appeared around this punch. They continuously spread in all directions, continuously affecting more and more space-time and affecting more and more worlds. Under this effect, the sky seemed to be completely shattered. No matter where one was in this world, they could see the effect of this punch when they looked up into the sky. They could see the endless fragments and cracks in the sky, and they could even vaguely see the endless murderous aura that filled the endless void beyond the sky. In the face of such a punch, the heavenly Tao had no choice but to return to its senses. It no longer cared about the network between itself and its corresponding existences on other realms. As endless power surged, rays of light flashed and gathered in front of Luo Fan's punch, trying its best to resist and suppress it. Crack, 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 crack. All sorts of earth-shattering booms erupted from the point of contact between the two. The light emitted by the heavenly Tao above continuously crumbled under Luo Fan's punch. Endless fragments flew in all directions. The scene was so terrifying that it had even reached a gorgeous level. The power of the heavenly Tao itself was extremely terrifying. Even the fragments alone were comparable to Luo Fan's. However, the weakness of the heavenly Tao was just too obvious. Moreover, the effect of Luo Fan's attack was just too terrifying. As a result, the defensive method that it had condensed at the critical moment of life and death only managed to slightly slow down Luo Fan's punch. In the end, it didn't even manage to reduce the power of the punch by much before it was completely broken through. At this point, the fist still didn't relax. Instead, it even sped up. In the blink of an eye, it broke through the void and plunged into the heavenly Tao. At this moment, the world fell silent. It felt as if time and space had suddenly stopped. Then, cracks appeared in the heavenly Tao out of nowhere. At this moment, all living beings in the world, the countless guardians, and even Shu Si felt as if a great disaster was about to befall them. They felt as if their lives were about to be extinguished. Chapter 2184. This was the thought that came to Shu Si's mind at this moment. She looked at Luo Fan, who was above, in disbelief. She looked at the fist that was pouring into the heavenly Tao, and the terrifying power released by the fist that was tearing the heavenly Tao apart bit by bit and destroying it. Luo Fan had always been on Shu Si's side of her heart. Even when Luo Fan had forcibly snatched the position of protector from her, she had unknowingly let go of her enmity towards Luo Fan. Unknowingly, she had already treated Luo Fan as an existence that she believed in. At this moment, Luo Fan's actions made it impossible for her to deceive herself anymore. It made her truly understand that he did not care about the thoughts of any living being in this world at all. It must be known that it was the heavenly way. Destroying the heavenly way meant that the entire world would fall into complete chaos, collapse, and eventually perish. Under such circumstances, he did not hesitate at all, nor did he show any mercy. He wanted to obliterate the heavenly Tao. Shu Xi's body trembled at the thought of his determination and heartlessness. An indescribable resentment was born in Shu Xi's heart at this moment. The more trust one had, the more resentment one would feel after being betrayed. Shu Xi had originally trusted Luo Fan. At this moment, after feeling Luo Fan's betrayal, the resentment in her heart grew even deeper. This resentment was so intense that it broke through the limits of her body in the blink of an eye. It was released in an instant and spread endlessly towards the entire world, enveloping a larger and larger area. During this process, the world started to tremble violently. The living beings that were enveloped by the resentment felt an absolute resentment rising from the depths of their hearts. Bit by bit, it fused with the resentment, making it grow stronger and more terrifying. During this process, strands of information continuously emerged from the bottom of Shu Xi's heart and continuously fused with the resentment. Gradually, it caused the resentment to undergo all sorts of subtle changes, turning its essence into an indescribably mysterious existence. With the support of this information, the extent of the resentment spread became even greater, and the speed at which it spread also became even faster. It seemed to have surpassed time and distance. In an instant, it had already covered most of the world, making it seem as if it had been dyed black. However, such a change prevented most of the world from collapsing with the collapse of the heavenly Tao. Although it was shaking violently, as if it was going to collapse in the next moment, it did not collapse in the end. It was still forcefully locked by the resentment and maintained a more or less complete state. Of course, this didn't seem to be a good thing for all the living beings here, because at this very moment, the thoughts of all the living beings here had been completely distorted by hatred. All of their thoughts had already turned into resentment towards the existence that stood between the heavenly Tao shards, as if it was an eternally immovable being of the God of creation. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart jolted. He had completely grasped the changes below and understood the source of all these changes. He frowned slightly and shook his head. He couldn't be bothered to pay attention to it. Instead, he clenched his fist and threw it forward. The momentum of the second punch was even more powerful than the first punch, and the phenomenon it created was even more terrifying than the first punch. Under this punch, the entire world seemed to have fallen into the fist wind of this punch. Endless power stirred. An endless impact spread in all directions. A terrifying sound directly shook the void, and all kinds of cracks and fragments spread everywhere in the world, stirring up the laws of the entire world, shaking the space and time of the entire world. Heaven and earth. Boundless, baleful aura surged incessantly under this punch, and it seemed to be constantly seeping into the world and fusing with it. As long as I completely wipe out the heavenly Tao, at least this tribulation will pass. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After countless years of sensing and deducing, he clearly knew that the pseudo-heavenly Tao was his greatest enemy in this tribulation. After the pseudo-heavenly Tao completely gave up on itself and fused with the heavenly Tao, the heavenly Tao had replaced the pseudo-heavenly Tao and become his opponent. Under such circumstances, as long as he completely shattered and destroyed the heavenly Tao, he would naturally be able to pass this tribulation. At the very least, this tribulation. As for the destruction of the heavenly Tao that would cause the destruction of the world, that was something that would happen after he passed the tribulation. Even if he couldn't endure the terrifying impact of the destruction of the world, and he couldn't escape from the destruction of the world, Destroying the heavenly Tao seemed to be the same as destroying the world with the attack of the tribulation. But in reality, the two situations were completely different. When the power of the fifth great tribulation descended and destroyed the world, he would not be able to transcend the world at all. Naturally, he would die along with the world under the power of the fifth great tribulation, and there was almost no chance of survival. However, if he took the initiative to destroy the heavenly Tao and cause the world to collapse, the situation would clearly be different. This was because before the world collapsed, he would have already escaped from the world because he had passed the tribulation. In this chaos, the world collapsed, the laws became chaotic, time and space disappeared, and all life was extinguished. As for the protective platform, it had already completely collapsed. Even the protector on it had already been torn apart and turned into the chaos that was getting closer and closer to primal chaos. This change made Shu Si extremely resentful. At this moment, her expression had already become extremely ruthless, and there wasn't the slightest bit of gentleness and beauty on her face. Crack, 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 crack. At this moment, a strange sound appeared in the world, suppressing all the other rumbles and sounds of chaos. This sound was so strange that any living being who heard it would suddenly feel their minds clear up, as if some kind of shackle that existed in their hearts was being broken. As this sound continued to ring out, the living beings that were originally shrouded in resentment gradually recovered from their resentment. All of them had strange expressions on their faces. What's going on? Why do we feel relaxed when the world is destroyed? A relatively powerful cultivator muttered at this moment, his expression filled with disbelief. Among them, Shu Si, who was the core of this resentment, did not wake up so easily. Even if the ka sounds continued to reverberate in her ears and heart, she still remained unwavering and was still brewing the strongest attack against Luo Fan. At this moment, the sky completely collapsed. Apart from the world that was filled with resentment, everything else had completely collapsed, including the place where Luo Fan stood. Everything that was originally above the heavenly Tao had completely collapsed at this moment, turning into countless fragments that poured down like rain. As they fell, they constantly melted and mixed, turning into absolute chaos. It seemed like the state of chaos died. At this moment, Shu Si finally seized the opportunity and roared. With this roar, her body suddenly exploded and turned into a pitch-black stream of light. It wrapped around the entire world that was filled with resentment, or rather, glued together, and charged towards Luo Fan rapidly. The size of the world had already exceeded the limits of ordinary living beings' imagination. With such a huge amount of the world rushing towards him, Luo Fan felt as if the entire chaotic state was pressing down on him at this moment. Time was already completely meaningless in this process. At this moment, the world had already lost its essence. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan just faintly smiled and spread his hands, letting the light that Shu Si had transformed into crush him with the power of heaven and earth. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Earth-shattering rumbles erupted at this moment. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan's body was crushed by the world and completely collapsed. Furthermore, it was the kind of absolute collapse that did not leave a single trace behind. In other words, after the collapse, not a single trace of his existence could be found. After all, Luo Fan was an existence that could forcefully destroy the heavenly Tao. Although such a collision had almost completely destroyed him, the world was not in a good state either. At this moment, with the point of collision as the center, the world started to continuously collapse and perish. In the end, almost no time was needed. The remaining pitch-black world had completely collapsed from the aftermath of the collision and turned into absolute chaos. Why? At this moment, Shu Si's figure condensed in the chaos. She had a look of disbelief in her eyes as she muttered. At this moment, although she was only a phantom, she was no longer pitch-black and full of resentment like before. On the contrary, she had regained her original elegance, and that confused look was even more adorable. Why did you give up your life? I don't believe that you don't have any way to resist. She muttered, and the confusion in her eyes became even more intense. Crack, 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 crack. The strange sound rang in her ears again. Because she had already broken free from resentment, Shu Xi's senses were many times sharper than before. At this moment, she could easily sense that the sound came from the bottom of her heart, from the outside world, and even from beyond the world. It was as if something that covered everything, including her soul, had been broken. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure gradually walked out from the surrounding chaos. His figure, his appearance, his strength, his aura, and everything else seemed to be in perfect condition, no different from when he was at his peak. Just like in the previous battle, when he completely abandoned his body and was smashed by the heavens and earth, it didn't happen to him. Have you calmed down? Luo Fan said to Shu Xi with a smile. As he spoke, he pointed his finger, and a strange barrier instantly enveloped Shu Xi. It instantly stopped her body, which was gradually collapsing and dying from the surrounding chaos, from deteriorating. At Shu Xi's level, there was no deterioration, no constant destruction. Even if her body was completely destroyed, she could quickly recover. Hence, under the protection of the barrier, her body quickly solidified, and in the blink of an eye, she had transformed into an intact body, as if nothing had happened. At this moment, she looked at Luo Fan with a blank, angry, and hateful gaze. I don't understand. At this moment, seeing that Luo Fan had returned, she felt angry that she had been fooled, but also inexplicably relaxed. Being fooled was naturally because Luo Fan had deliberately pretended that he had been crushed and killed to deceive her. As for the inexplicable relief, it was because after her resentment had been reduced a lot, her expectations for Luo Fan had reemerged, which made her start to have a fluke mentality in her heart. Perhaps things were not as she thought, and perhaps there would be a turning point. You'll understand very soon. Just watch. Luo Fan only smiled at this moment. The changes that were about to happen next were also what he had guessed. It was also because of this that he had forcefully endured the impact of the world and endured the terrifying impact that directly acted on his body, completely erasing his body and everything else in the real world. Moreover, because the impact contained all sorts of mysteries, it even spread to thousands of other planes through his connection with other planes, erasing the existences corresponding to the thousands of planes at the same time. If it wasn't for the fact that he had already communicated with hundreds of millions of planes, he might have screwed up this time. However, since he didn't screw up, this kind of damage was only a small problem for him. With just a thought, the existences corresponding to him in those planes that were affected were naturally reborn. In fact, they were no different from before, and he couldn't feel the damage that almost killed him previously at all. At this moment, under the influence of some incomprehensible power, the boundless chaos began to gradually separate. Endless heaven and earth naturally condensed from the chaos and began to continuously build and build in this chaos in all sorts of indescribable and unimaginable ways. Gradually, the earth formed, the sky formed, the mountains formed, the rivers formed, the oceans formed, the plants formed, and the living beings formed. Time was completely meaningless in this process. It seemed like billions of trillions of years had passed, but it also seemed like only an instant. When Shu Xi came back to her senses, an incomparably perfect vast world, where every substance was composed of endless heaven and earth, appeared in front of her. Chapter 2185. Everything that happened before her eyes had almost completely overturned all of Shu Xi's previous guesses and thoughts. It made her realize that her previous resentment seemed to be completely unnecessary. Luo Fan's expression was somewhat inexplicable as he said, "The heavenly Tao is actually not necessary in this world." Shu Xi was taken aback when she heard this, and she instinctively retorted, "How is that possible? Without the heavenly Tao, how can the world exist?" To Shu Xi, who was born and raised in this world, the existence of the heavenly Tao was absolute common sense. To them, there could be nothing in this world and nothing could exist, but the heavenly Tao absolutely must exist. Once there was no heavenly Tao, then the world would obviously have lost its foundation and would inevitably collapse and be destroyed. It was precisely because of this concept that they respected the heavenly Tao so much. That was why they were so furious and resentful when they saw Luo Fan shatter the heavenly Tao. Looking at Shu Xi's completely disbelieving expression, Luo Fan only smiled slightly and pointed down without saying anything. Looking down at where Luo Fan was pointing, Shu Xi's expression froze. Right now, the world below was gradually stabilizing, and order was being re-established from the chaos. It was being reborn, and new creatures and civilizations were evolving. Wasn't all of this the best proof of what Luo Fan said? If the heavenly Tao really disappeared, the world would collapse and be destroyed. In that case, now that the heavenly Tao had been destroyed, how could the world below still exist? Why wasn't it destroyed along with it? In this way, it was obvious that what Luo Fan had said before didn't need to be refuted at all. It was simply the truth in front of them. But how is this possible? Without the heavenly Tao, what can the world rely on? Shu Xi murmured, her expression full of doubt and confusion. In the depths of her eyes, there were countless flashes of light and shadows that constantly flickered. In response to Shu Xi's doubt, Luo Fan had no intention of interfering at all. He just quietly looked at the evolving world below and watched the order that was gradually condensing. For Shu Xi, this kind of doubt was a kind of opportunity, an opportunity that allowed her to surpass herself. If he were to blabber and give her a hint, it would directly eliminate this kind of opportunity for her. Perhaps Shu Xi would be happy at the moment, but she would soon find out what she had done, and she would definitely feel unhappy. How could he do something so strenuous and unrewarding? Shu Xi didn't know, but Luo Fan couldn't be clearer. The heavenly Tao was not necessary for any part of the world. It was the same even in a certain layer of the world that almost simulated the state of chaos. For a long time, among all the worlds that Luo Fan had experienced, the heavenly Tao was only present in this world that he had encountered during the Great Calamity. Among all the worlds that he had encountered before, there was only one thing that was truly indispensable: the Great Tao. The Great Tao that was born before the world and destroyed after the world. Ever since Luo Fan had entered this world, the one that truly controlled everything seemed to be the supreme, heavenly Tao above the void. It was as if all power, laws, power, and vitality were born from the heavenly Tao. If Luo Fan had been born and raised in this world, he might have been so shocked that he would think that the heavenly Tao was indispensable to this world. However, he clearly wasn't. His countless experiences in the past clearly told him that the true thing that controlled everything in this world was the Great Tao. When he had just stepped into this world, he had vaguely sensed the existence of the Great Tao. However, the Great Tao was extremely huge and boundless. Just sensing its existence already gave him endless pressure and even almost caused his mind to collapse. After that, he discovered the existence of the heavenly Tao. It was precisely that discovery that caused him to unknowingly be assimilated by the world. Unknowingly, he had overlooked the boundless and boundless Great Tao that was hidden behind it, and his gaze had gradually converged onto the heavenly Tao. It wasn't until not too long ago that he'd completely destroyed the heaven's way that he'd realized how big of a mistake he'd made. Destroying the heavenly Tao was merely killing the controller of this world on the surface. The true controller of this world and everything in this world was the Great Tao in the end. So long as the Great Tao wasn't destroyed, so long as the Great Tao still existed, then no matter how the heavenly Tao was destroyed, no matter how the world was destroyed, and no matter how many times the living beings within it were born and destroyed, this world would definitely recover. It was precisely because of this that he had been so relaxed earlier. He didn't feel any guilt toward Shu Xi, and he had even completely disregarded the invasion of resentment from the numerous living beings. Suddenly, Luo Fan had a flash of realization. The relationship between the heavenly Tao and the Great Tao seems to be slightly familiar. He couldn't help but laugh when he thought about it for a moment. He understood why he felt this feeling was rather familiar. The relationship between the heavenly Tao and the great Tao was actually of the same nature as the relationship between him and Shu Si. The control that the heavenly Tao possessed over the world was bestowed upon it by the great Tao. This was just like how Shu Si had become a guardian earlier, because Luo Fan had bestowed upon her the authority to control some of the guardian platforms. However, the scale and level of the two were worlds apart. At this moment, an endless river appeared in the void, instantly linking up every inch of the void, every part of the world, every piece of space-time, every law and law. With the appearance of this long river, Luo Fan instantly felt the kind of supreme pressure that he had felt when he first sensed the great Tao. Even his mind, his soul, his life source, and even the corresponding existences on the various levels that he communicated with all felt an unimaginable pressure acting on him at this moment. In his daze, he even felt like his body was about to completely collapse and be destroyed in the next moment. This is the great Tao. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. No, this isn't an ordinary great Tao. This is the chaotic great Tao. Then he instantly overturned his previous thoughts, and an even more accurate thought emerged from the bottom of his heart. As this thought appeared in his mind, the endless and extremely dazzling light in his eyes that he couldn't even see its outline changed instantly. It turned into an endless river of chaos that came from nowhere. Its flow was unknown. In this river of chaos, there seemed to be an endless world, and endless power. There was an extremely chaotic time, an extremely strange space, and there seemed to be infinite matter and endless mysteries. The moment he saw this river of chaos, he felt an endless amount of information directly pouring into his mind in an extremely violent and manic way. It poured into the depths of his memories and began to crazily attack his soul, his will, and the essence of his life. At this moment, Luo Fan felt like his body and the existences corresponding to his various planes were about to explode from this impact. No, this wasn't just a feeling. It was real. Whether it was his plane of reality or the existence corresponding to who knows how many billions of planes, they were all gradually collapsing. He was blasted away by the endless information, words, and light from the inside out. I still don't have the qualifications to comprehend this great Tao that connects to the state of chaos. Even if this is only the chaotic great Tao simulated by the fifth tribulation. At this moment, such a thought appeared in the depths of Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, boundless spiritual light appeared from his body. After this spiritual light appeared, it would sublimate and change countless times in an instant. Concept abilities continuously appeared on the surface of the spiritual light before completely fusing into it and disappearing without a trace. In this state, time was completely meaningless. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed like it was just a moment, but it also seemed like countless trillions of years had passed. All the concept abilities that belonged to the world of laws appeared in the spiritual light before completely disappearing. After this change, the spirit light had completely changed. It had turned into a grayish, glue-like spirit light. It was an extremely strange spirit light, and it quietly floated before him. Immediately after, just as Luo Fan's body was about to completely collapse, the spiritual light instantly turned into a sharp blade that slashed towards his body. This slash seemed to split open the world, the chaos, and the great Tao as it forcefully slashed into Luo Fan's body. At this moment, all sorts of strange sounds of destruction continuously emerged from his body. With every sound, an endless amount of information leaked out of his body, and with every sound, his eyes became a little dimmer. Just like this, after the almost never-ending sound was finally compressed to an instant, Luo Fan's body suddenly collapsed. His entire body, along with all traces of his existence, completely disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. This even included the sharp blade of spiritual light that he slashed out just now, as he completely disappeared. In other planes, the corresponding existence of Luo Fan naturally stopped expanding and breaking. Instead, it began to heal and recover at an unimaginable speed. Then, in the plane of reality, Luo Fan's body began to step out of nothingness and reappeared beside Shu Si. However, at this time, he no longer had the leisurely feeling of walking out of nothingness. Instead, he vomited blood with every step he took, and his body collapsed with every step he took. It felt like there were countless bombs compressed in his body, constantly exploding and bombarding his body. "What's wrong with you?" At this moment, Shu Si suddenly returned to her senses and looked at Luo Fan in disbelief. Her eyes were filled with shock and even inexplicable worry. When Luo Fan saw her appearance, he knew that she didn't see the great Tao of primal chaos. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart, but on the surface, he just smiled and said, "I just saw something I shouldn't have. I won't die." At this moment, he completely retracted his gaze, his senses, and even his instincts. He did not look at or sense the chaotic path below at all. But even so, at this moment, there was still endless information pouring into the depths of his heart. It was still impacting his mind, his body, and his life essence at all times. This terrifying impact was completely unbearable for him. His entire body continuously collapsed and perished under this impact. At this moment, he almost needed to repair his body tens of thousands of times every second. And every time he tried to repair it, he would need to change all the power and substance in his body. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan seemed to be standing next to Shu Si without any changes, but in fact, he had to change his body millions of times every second. Shu Si was not completely clear about the changes in Luo Fan, but after all, her cultivation realm was not bad, so she could see some of the contents. She showed an inexplicable worry on her face and said, "Are you really okay? I think you're in a bad situation." "Haha, fortunately, there was a battle with the heavenly way. Otherwise, I might have really died now." Luo Fan just smiled at this time, and the expression on his face seemed to be a little better than before. The explosions, impacts, and destruction within his body were still going on at all times. But the frequency and speed seemed to be a little slower than before. He wasn't just comforting himself. In fact, the reason why he was still here and still able to keep his body intact was indeed because of the battle with the heavenly Tao. It was precisely because of his previous battle with the Heaven's Way that he had a rather deep understanding of the Heaven's Way, and it could even be said that he had a near complete grasp of the Heaven's Way. This allowed him to use various subtle methods to sort out the information that poured into his body, giving him sufficient time and strength to channel the information out, lest the information completely explode and completely tear his body apart. From a certain point of view, he should be grateful to the heavenly way. Chapter 2186. Luo Fan only smiled faintly at this moment. This smile, combined with the extremely tragic changes in his body, revealed an indescribable strangeness. At this time, in every level, Luo Fan's corresponding existence seemed to have recovered, but at the same time, some kind of subtle change was also happening, as if they were also enduring some kind of indescribable pressure that was released from the inside out. Of course, the situation in the various layers was still much better than the situation in the real world. At the very least, the changes in those layers seemed to be tempering the existences corresponding to them, but it was not as powerful as the existences in the real world, and it did not make him feel as if he was walking towards death. At this moment, Luo Fan already knew in his heart that the opponent he would encounter in this great calamity was actually not the fake heavenly Tao, or even the heavenly Tao, but the world below, or in other words, the great Tao that existed in this world. It was the simulated great Tao of chaos. The existence of the great Tao of chaos was a concept that Luo Fan had established for the first time. Before this, he had never known that there was a great Tao that controlled everything in the state of chaos. There was a great Tao that contained all the mysteries and principles. However, when he truly saw the endless river of light that seemed like a chaotic river that lay across space, and controlled everything in space, he finally had such a concept. He knew that it was the grand Tao of chaos, and he knew that it contained all the profundities, energy, matter, time, laws, and laws that belong to the state of chaos were contained within it. It was also the instant he understood the nature of the river of light that he knew who his true opponent was in this calamity. This great calamity was not a test of who was stronger between him and the pseudo-heavenly way, nor was it a test of who would survive until the end. Instead, it was a test of whether he could transcend the great Tao of chaos. Could he transcend this world under the restrictions of the great Tao of chaos? If he could not transcend, he would be directly corroded by the great Tao of chaos, fuse with it, and eventually become a part of it. In other words, he would become a part of this world. If that was the case, he might still be alive, but he would no longer be the person he was before, and he would no longer be the person he was before. If he had directly faced the Tao of chaos when he first entered this world, it would naturally be almost impossible for him to transcend under the restrictions of the Tao of chaos. Perhaps he would be overwhelmed by the boundless information in the instant he saw the great Tao of chaos, and his existence would completely disappear. However, it was clear that this was not the case for him. Previously, he had encountered the heavenly Tao, and he had relied on his own comprehension and progress over the past hundreds of billions of years to break through the heavenly Tao and obtain experience that was of utmost importance to him. It was this experience that allowed him to use his incomparably strong will to transfer this information away when he faced the endless information. This allowed him to maintain his existence under the impact of the endless information with great difficulty and prevent himself from exploding from the overload of information. At this time, Luo Fan felt neither joy nor worry in his heart. His mind was incomparably firm, and he tried his best to condense his will. Wisps of light were emitted from his life essence, constantly sweeping away the endless information that was like the overturning of mountains and rivers, and maintaining the purity and completeness of his life source with great difficulty. During this process, the spiritual light emitted from his life source was constantly changing. It sometimes turned into the court of arbitration, sometimes into the heavenly Tao, and sometimes into the worldview of laws. It constantly collided with the endless information, destroyed the endless information around it, and transferred the endless information around it. This could no longer even be called his resistance, but a kind of war. His body, and even his corresponding existences on various planes, had undergone changes, big or small, precisely because of this incomparably terrifying war. At this moment, an inexplicable feeling of emptiness suddenly appeared on Luo Fan's face. A hazy feeling of chaos gradually flowed out from his body. This aura of chaos was so real and so perfect that it was as if he had completely turned into a state of chaos and become a part of it. This aura became stronger and stronger as it was exerted, and it became more and more obvious. The reason for this was very simple. At this moment, the information from the great Tao of primal chaos that was pouring into Luo Fan's body had eroded his body and power, and then transformed it, causing his body and power to gradually transform into a form similar to the great Tao of primal chaos. Then his body gradually became like this and emitted this kind of aura. This change happened when he was out of Luo Fan's perception. After all, at this moment, Luo Fan had almost exhausted all of his strength just to resist the information that was as if an endless world was pressing down on him at the same time. How could he still have the mind to pay attention to the changes in his body? It must be known that once his mind was changed, even if his body was intact, he would no longer be himself. In contrast, as long as his mind existed, even if his body collapsed and perished, he would still be himself. In this way, there was no need to say what to focus on. "How are you?" Shu Xi's face was filled with shock when she saw this. Although at this moment, Luo Fan seemed to have obtained a huge benefit, as if he had suddenly obtained some power that he didn't have before. However, looking at Luo Fan's illusory and dazed expression, it didn't seem like he had obtained any benefits at all. On the contrary, It seemed like he had gone berserk. However, it was obvious that the amount of information from the great Tao of chaos that Luo Fan was enduring was many times more than at the beginning. He had long since lost the energy to sense the changes in the outside world. Naturally, he couldn't respond to Shu Xi's words at all. At this moment, she suddenly felt an indescribable supreme existence descend into the world she was in. This kind of supreme existence gave her such a warm feeling. Yet it was also so vast. It felt like the entire world was welcoming her at this moment. With every breath she took, she felt like she could enjoy the limitless treatment of the world, allowing her strength and her body to rise at an unimaginable speed. For Shu Xi, such a situation could almost be considered a fortuitous encounter. What's going on? Shu Xi was secretly shocked. She turned her head and looked around. However, she only found that the surroundings seemed to be a little brighter, but there were no other changes. However, at this time, she discovered that the situation of Luo Fan, who was not far from her, seemed to have become even more difficult to understand. Indistinctly, there were wisps of grayish existences seeping out of his body, but they quickly returned to his body and disappeared without a trace. At the same time, the chaotic aura emanating from his body became even stronger. At this moment, a light suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's eyes. Amidst the light, he let out a roar, and an unknown amount of power that Shu Xi could not understand erupted from his body. It instantly shattered his body and the endless chaotic aura he was releasing at this moment. With this change, Shu Xi's mind actually relaxed. Compared to his previous state where he seemed to have obtained endless benefits, Luo Fan seemed to have suffered a great loss, and even his body seemed to have been erased. However, the strong will in his voice, the terrifying will that could not be denied and could not be broken felt more familiar to her. She also understood that this was the real Luo Fan. This kind of Luo Fan was truly free. After understanding this, she naturally felt relaxed. At this moment, Luo Fan's voice rang out beside her. Go cultivate. The evolution of the world is a great opportunity for you. Don't let it go. What about you? Shu Xi hurriedly asked. She had actually wanted to ask this question from the very beginning. It was just that she never found the opportunity. Now that she finally had the chance, how could she not ask it? I'm fine. The next challenge belongs to me. Luo Fan only smiled. As he laughed, there seemed to be puffing sounds coming from his body. It was very strange. Shu Xi asked again and noted it down. After discovering that Luo Fan had nothing else to say, she could only sigh, descend, and head towards the newly born land below. The current state of this world was equivalent to the birth of heaven and earth. Under this state, everything in the world was in a state of being born and just beginning to evolve. This also meant that the chaotic heaven's way that was hidden behind this world was constantly revealing the endless principles and mysteries that it had engraved and possessed, bit by bit. If she had the chance to carefully experience such an opportunity, she would naturally be able to comprehend endless principles and find endless mysteries. This was an even more crucial opportunity for Shu Xi. Once she could grasp it, her cultivation realm would be greatly improved. She could even directly cross a realm and go from the third tribulation to the fourth tribulation. It would not be unbelievable. Of course, this was only for Shu Xi. It was clearly not the case for Luo Fan. Because his perception was many times stronger than Shu Xi's, he was able to see much more than Shu Xi. Shu Xi could at most see the various changes in the world caused by the chaotic heavenly Tao. He could directly see the chaotic heavenly Tao. However, it was precisely because he could see the chaotic heavenly Tao that he was in such a tragedy. At this moment, Luo Fan was not in the plane of reality. Or rather, he had not completely entered the plane of reality. Currently, he was in between the plane of reality and the plane of concept. To be more specific, he was in the place where the barrier that he had used to envelop Shu Xi was. Just now, when the world seemed to have completely collapsed, the barrier that he had placed on Shu Xi was the barrier between the planes, the barrier between the plane of reality and the plane of concept. It was precisely this barrier between the planes that could be so small and thin, but it could withstand the supreme power released from the complete collapse of the world. Only then could Shu Si feel an indescribable sense of security at that moment. After all, although the world had been destroyed and destroyed, the terrifying power that was released was not controlled by living beings. Instead, it was released randomly in all directions. In such a state, it was naturally unable to break through the plane of reality and come into contact with the barrier between the plane of reality and the plane of concept. This allowed Shu Si to not be affected by the chaos at all. At this moment, what Luo Fan was doing was using the same principle. He hid inside the barrier and did his best to resist the corrosion of the information contained in the chaotic heavenly Tao so that he would not explode from the information. This method was clearly more effective than the various methods he had used to sever the connection between himself and the chaotic heavenly Tao in the plane of reality. At the very least, in the plane of reality, even if he used all kinds of isolation methods, he could still feel the chaotic heavenly Tao constantly instilling information into the depths of his heart. At this moment, even if he stared at Shu Si and occasionally glanced at the chaotic heavenly Tao, he could only feel the same instilling speed and strength as before. After sending Shu Si away, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. Rays of spiritual light emerged from his body and began to weave and build on his body. They gradually turned into layers of structures that were similar to barriers between planes, gradually isolating his body from the outside world. These rays of spiritual light were mysterious and wonderful. Not only did they contain the various concepts and abilities of the worldview of laws, but they also contained the mysteries of the various planes that he had comprehended. They even vaguely contained the mysteries of the heavenly Tao. As he moved, and the number of barriers continued to increase, he could clearly feel that the amount of information that was constantly pouring in from the outside world was constantly decreasing. The most intuitive reaction was that the impact of the endless information on his mind was also becoming smaller and smaller. Originally, the information seemed to be converging from countless worlds, but now, as he increased the number of barriers to hundreds of billions, the impact had already been reduced to the impact of a large river. Moreover, the impact contained most of the information that he had obtained in the past, which was just the information released from the heavenly Tao. In this way, the pressure he felt was naturally much lower. It was also at this moment that his body finally returned to normal. The existences corresponding to him in the other planes also gradually calmed down at this time. It was as if the changes in his reality had finally given some strong support to the existences corresponding to him in the other planes, allowing them to finally stabilize under the impact. Finally stabilized. When the changes were completed, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression relaxed a little. Of course, it was only a little. Although it had stabilized now, it was obviously only temporary. As time passed, new changes could happen at any time. Who knew when the information would explode and break through the countless barriers, causing his body to explode? More importantly, stabilizing was not the result he wanted. The final result he wanted was to break through this world and transcend this world so that he could survive the fifth Great Tribulation. This was obviously not something that could be achieved with such stability. With a slight movement in his heart, Luo Fan completely immersed his mind in his own mind and began to experience the information that entered his mind after layers of isolation and screening. The information brought him endless pressure and made him feel the danger of death. But at the same time, it also brought him huge opportunities, because the information came from the great Tao of chaos. Even if it was a simulation of the great Tao of chaos, under such circumstances, one could imagine just how profound the profoundness contained within it was. Even though most of the information had been filtered, and even though a large amount of information had been obtained from the great Tao, the remaining information alone was enough to make Luo Fan obsessed. At every moment, he felt that he was comprehending all kinds of mysteries that he had never comprehended before, and he felt that his worldview of laws was absorbing sufficient nutrients from it. Along with this change, his body gradually turned into a stone-like state. His aura was completely restrained within his body, and not the slightest bit leaked out. The barrier on his body flickered all the time, as if it was undergoing some kind of transition and some kind of change at every moment. It was more like some kind of targeted adjustment was being carried out at all times. Along with this change, time passed slowly, and before he knew it, millions of years had passed. For the entire world, these million years were simply a period of tremendous change. From the time when the world was almost completely destroyed until now, millions of years later, the entire world had changed from nothing to something. It had long become full of vitality, and countless powerful civilizations had even been born. Chapter 2187. For Shu Si, who had been left behind by Luo Fan, these million years had been a great opportunity for her to develop. It made her feel like she had turned back into the ant she had been when she had just started cultivating. She could feel that she had comprehended some of the mysteries of cultivation that she had never comprehended before at every moment. She could feel that her understanding of the world had been overturned at every moment, and she could feel that her cultivation realm had increased. She could also sense the changes in the world during this process. As she sensed all these things, doubts began to appear in her heart. Now, after the destruction of the heavenly way, there were no longer any traces of its existence in the world. Everything seemed to be evolving naturally. However, all of this seemed so natural, so smooth, and so perfect. It even felt more perfect and intoxicating than when the heavenly way had existed. This development had almost completely overturned her previous views and her understanding of the world. She would occasionally fall into doubt when she completed a certain stage of cultivation. The direction in which the world had developed over the past million years had gradually led the world to a result that seemed completely different from before, but was shockingly similar in nature. After a million years, countless living beings had been born in the world, countless civilizations had been born, and an even greater number of cultivation systems and civilizations had been born. These cultivation systems and civilizations had spread across the world in an extremely balanced manner, dividing the world into regions. They vaguely seemed to coincide with the regions that had been protected by the protective platforms. However, the protective platforms that had existed in the past to protect a certain area of this world no longer existed at this time. As for the protectors, they had completely disappeared, as if there had never been any protectors in the world in the first place. This was the state that was different yet similar. With Shu Si's cultivation realm, she could sense the scenes of a very large region. However, he could only sense what was within the range of his senses. What he could sense was only a very, very small portion of this world. She could no longer use the mysterious power to sense the entire world like before. Under these circumstances, the reason why she could sense the various situations of the world in the past million years was because she had relied on her own cultivation to travel all over the world. It was also because she had traveled all over the world that she could see more of the mysteries of the world's natural evolution. It was also why her cultivation realm had improved so much. Now, it was even comparable to the ability she had after borrowing the value of Luo Fan's protective platform. Is the heavenly way really not necessary? This day, Shu Si looked up at the sky, and such a thought flashed through her mind. She was looking at none other than the place where the heavenly way had been. It was the key core of the world that she had previously known. However, at this time it was empty. There was no substance, no special laws, no gathering of power. It felt like it was any other place in the surroundings. There was nothing special about it at all. Even though she had seen it for a million years, every time she saw it, she still felt as if a lifetime had passed. Master, you're daydreaming again. At this moment, a voice entered Shu Si's ears. Then, a woman's figure condensed behind Shu Si. It was a cultivator whose power was close to the false sage stage. This woman's appearance was vaguely similar to Shu Si's, but her entire body naturally emitted an aura that belonged to this world. It was as if she was constantly communicating with this world in an indescribable manner. This woman was none other than a connate life form that had been born naturally in this world in the past million years. Shuxi's existence also played an important role in her birth. It was precisely because Shuxi had been cultivating on a spirit mountain that was in the process of taking form that her aura had poured into the spirit mountain, causing it to tremble with her power. That was why the spirit mountain had ended up like this. This also caused the spirit mountain to have an inexplicable connection with her. It was precisely because of this that Shuxi had taken her in as a disciple after she took form, taught her the cultivation method, and guided her onto the path of cultivation. After all, the life form that the spirit mountain had transformed into was a connate life form. She was born with all sorts of incredible characteristics, and her aptitude for cultivation was unimaginably strong. Although it had only been a short million years, he had already surpassed the cultivation process that ordinary living beings would need to spend 10 billion years, or even more than 100 billion years. He had cultivated to his current cultivation realm and become an existence close to the pseudo-saint stage. When Shuxi heard this, she returned to her senses and smiled. "You've already broken through?" "Not yet. This so-called false sage level was simply too difficult. To become the absolute controller of a certain world, and the scope of this world can't be small. This is simply tearing myself into countless parts." When the woman heard this, she cried out bitterly. Shuxi merely smiled and said, "Don't be anxious. Your current cultivation speed is already very fast. It's good to be stuck in this realm for a period of time and consolidate your foundation." "Esteemed master, you keep saying that I'm still building my foundation. However, out of all the living beings I've encountered, aside from Master, there isn't a single one of them that can withstand the pressure of my presence. Am I really still just building my foundation?" The woman suddenly asked. This question seemed to have been accumulated in her heart for a long time. Now that she finally asked it, she looked relaxed, and even her mental state had faintly improved. To her, who wholeheartedly treated Shuxi as a supreme existence, these words could almost be said to be an offense and suspicion towards Shuxi. It was precisely because of this that she had such doubts all along, but she still did not dare to ask. Until now, she finally could not suppress this doubt and finally asked. Only then did she feel at ease and her thoughts were clear. Shuxi sensed the changes in the woman's body, and a gratified look appeared in her eyes. She smiled and said, "You finally asked. I thought you would have asked 300,000 years ago, but I didn't expect you to actually endure for 300,000 years." Hearing this, the woman's expression changed slightly, and her gaze towards Shuxi was filled with even more doubt. Since Shuxi had already seen through it, why didn't she tell her back then? Could it be that there was something special about it? "Master, please dispel my doubts," she immediately said. Shuxi smiled and said, "Do you know how many existences in this world were stronger than me before the world was destroyed?" "Well, there shouldn't be many. At most, one slap," the woman said rather uneasily. As she spoke, she seemed to be quite worried that her estimate was too high and offended Shuxi. Hearing this, Shuxi smiled bitterly and shook her head. "You've overestimated me. Although I feel that I've improved a lot over the years, if I were in the world before the world was destroyed, I would at most be in the top 1 billion. And this is only what I know. What I don't know is that there are still countless powerhouses hidden somewhere in this world. This number might even increase by a few times." The woman's expression changed drastically, and she cried out, "That's impossible." At this moment, her heart was filled with disbelief. She even felt that Shuxi was deliberately debasing herself to boost her confidence and belief. After all, this was just too ridiculous no matter how she looked at it. One had to know that even with her current cultivation level, she could become the absolute ruler of an area of billions of light years, and no living being could withstand the pressure of her aura. But compared to her master, she was still an insignificant ant. In fact, her master did not even need to attack her at all. She only needed a single thought to attack her, and it would be enough for her to die a tragic death. She would believe such a terrifying existence, even if she was said to be invincible in this world. Yet, she said that there were at least 1 billion existences stronger than her. This simply toppled her worldview. When she heard this, the only thought that came to her mind was disbelief. Shusi sighed and said, "Nothing's impossible. Debasing myself won't happen to me." Impossible. Impossible. The woman's aura surged, and the surrounding space-time became chaotic. The laws in the surroundings twisted, and the space-time that filled the surrounding space was constantly stirred and collapsing. This kind of ability, just by looking at the scene, was obviously quite extraordinary. Regardless of which world he was in, he could be said to be a powerful existence. At this moment, Shu Si did not care about the shock in her heart or the chaos in her aura. She only continued to say, "Otherwise, how do you think this world was destroyed and reborn?" Her words instantly destroyed the woman's hope of getting lucky. The power in her body trembled slightly, and waves of shattering spread out in all directions. However, the chaos was instantly wiped out by Shu Si's mind, and everything returned to normal. The world had been destroyed and reborn. As a living being that was born naturally, the woman was naturally aware of this. In fact, the many traces that existed in this world also prove this. For example, the traces of time that existed in the depths of the origin of life of those natural-born creatures, the subtle vicissitudes that had accumulated in the depths of the world, and even the traces of inheritance that existed in her bloodline. All of these prove this point. However, she did not understand how the world was destroyed and reborn. All this while, she had only thought that it was a natural process of the world's evolution. It was a change that would naturally occur when the world developed to a certain stage. It was just like what she had always seen in this world, the little bits and pieces of the world evolving in a certain way. However, now that she heard her master's words, she knew that all of this was just her own wishful thinking. The world's destruction and rebirth was simply the result of battles between cultivators. It was because of the battles between the countless powerful beings that existed before the world was reborn. As a result, her understanding of cultivation, her understanding of the world, and her understanding of powerful beings was instantly overturned. At this moment, she finally understood what her master meant when he said that she was still building her foundation and that she was still an extremely weak cultivator. In fact, she even deeply acknowledged this point, and she became extremely ashamed of her previous complacency. "I didn't expect it to be like this," she mumbled. Shusi looked at her with a gratified expression and said with a smile, "You don't have to care too much. How the world was before it was reborn won't have much of an impact after it is reborn. As long as you progress step by step, you will eventually reach that realm in the future. Even surpassing me might not be impossible." The woman replied respectfully, "Yes, this disciple will keep it in mind." Shusi nodded and sighed. She turned around and took a step forward. Her figure disappeared without a trace, and she re-entered the dojo that she had opened up and entered a state of cultivation again. Her disciple stood there for a long time. She raised her head and looked in the direction that Shu Si had been staring at. She was trying to find out what could make her almost omnipotent master stare blankly. However, it was a pity that her harvest this time was the same as all the previous times. She still did not gain anything, and all she saw was an empty space. After a long time, the woman sighed and said with dissatisfaction, "What? You haven't even answered my question." It's like this every time. She and Shu Si were master and disciple, but their relationship was like that of mother and daughter. After all, she had appeared by Shu Si's side as soon as she was born, and she was even born because of Shu Si. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine their relationship. It was because of this relationship that she did not fear Shu Si so much, and she could occasionally joke with her. Just as she was about to withdraw her gaze, she seemed to see a figure flash past in the void all of a sudden. The figure was extremely huge, and it felt like a giant that could support the heavens. When it appeared in the void, it even covered the sky. "What's that?" The woman was instantly stunned. The figure had only flashed by, and the time it had existed in the void was extremely short. Even the shortest time interval could not describe the time it had appeared. However, it was precisely such an existence that left an incomparably deep impression on her at this moment. She felt that the existence of this figure seemed to exceed the impression that her master had left in her heart, and it even vaguely seemed to want to completely expel all of her cultivation, and all of her past achievements in cultivation. Along with this change, the aura on the woman's body began to surge violently, and energy constantly leaked out of her body, causing the surrounding time and space to shatter. At this moment, the surrounding void seemed to be constantly stirred up by a huge hand, and it became chaotic. Soft sounds came from her body at this moment. Amidst the sounds, her body seemed to have turned into a broken sack. Holes appeared on her body from time to time, and an endless amount of blood spurted out of her body like it was free. At this moment, Shu Si, who was about to cultivate in her own dojo, suddenly sensed something. Her expression changed, and she appeared beside the woman in a flash. When he saw the incomparably tragic scene of the woman, his expression abruptly turned ugly. "What's going on? Who attacked you?" As she asked this, she raised her hand and shrouded the void around her disciple. In an instant, an extremely mysterious spiritual light appeared from her hand and instantly enveloped her disciple. Her disciple's entire body was bathed in the spiritual light, and all the chaos within her body no longer flowed out and could only be confined within her body. Is it caused by the changes in her body? In an instant, she already understood the source of the changes in her disciple's body. As her expression changed slightly, traces of her consciousness rushed into her disciple's body under the spiritual light, and she began to delve deep into her life source to investigate the source of the changes in her body. If it was in the past, she would have been able to accomplish this easily. After all, she had watched her disciple start cultivating from the very beginning, and she had even seen the process of her disciple's birth. Her understanding of her disciple had already reached a deeper level than her own. However, that was only in the past. At this moment, the situation was clearly completely different. At this moment, the power within her body was extremely chaotic, and within this chaos, there was an unimaginable profoundness hidden within. This profoundness caused the power of this chaos to be millions of times stronger than her own ability. At this moment, Shu Si was actually faintly unable to suppress this chaos. Her consciousness that was protected by the spiritual light seemed to be extremely powerless under this chaos, and it seemed like it was about to collapse at any moment. Facing this change, Shu Si's expression became even more unsightly. What kind of information did she receive? What kind of wrong comprehension did she receive? This situation was clearly because her disciple had obtained some kind of comprehension that far exceeded what she could bear in that instant. She had obtained a profound performance that far exceeded the scope of what she could accept. Sensing the powerlessness in her consciousness, Shu Si could only do her best to activate her ability. Countless spiritual lights continuously poured into her disciple's body, and bit by bit, she sorted out the chaos within. Chapter 2188. At the end of the day, Shu Si was countless times more powerful than her disciple. After continuously suppressing, combing, and digging, she finally came into contact with the source of her disciple's changes. She came into contact with the source that caused her body to go berserk. The moment she came into contact with the source, she was completely shocked. This was because she felt a strange sense of familiarity from the source, as if she had come into contact with it for countless years. It was to the extent that the concept of its existence was deeply engraved into her instincts. It was none other than an extremely familiar figure. It was Luo Fan's figure. However, at this moment, the figure in his disciple's heart seemed so grand, and its form had undergone such a huge change that he did not even dare to recognize that it was Luo Fan from back then. If it was not for the fact that his familiarity with Luo Fan had reached a certain limit, he might have treated this figure as some kind of phenomenon that had appeared out of thin air. The moment she came into contact with the source, she naturally understood why he had obtained it. She knew that he had appeared out of nowhere in the void, where the heavenly way should have been. Is he going to become the heavenly way as well? A thought flashed through Shu Xi's mind. When she thought of this, she could not help but shiver. She had already seen the existence that wanted to become the heavenly way. It was the pseudo-heavenly way. The pseudo-heavenly way had brought great trouble to the world, and it had caused the world to suffer great dangers. She only needed to close her eyes to see it again. Under these circumstances, when she discovered that Luo Fan actually wanted to become the pseudo-heavenly way, she suddenly felt at a loss and did not know how to deal with it. As she felt at a loss, the mysterious principles released by the figure in her disciple's body continued to show their might. It caused the woman's body to tremble, and the power around her became chaotic. It almost completely tore her body, her soul, and her will apart. The woman could not help but let out a grunt when she suffered such a blow. The world around her trembled slightly, and the chaotic sounds that had gradually calmed down became even more chaotic. When Shu Xi discovered this, she instantly returned to her senses. She immediately used her inner strength to forcefully press into her disciple's body, wrapping around that mysterious figure. Then she suddenly pulled, as if she was pulling a huge world, and with a loud rumble, that figure was forcibly pulled out of her body. After the figure was pulled out, it began to expand and contract. An endless suction force was generated from its body, and it began to absorb all the energy in the surroundings, all the rules and laws, and even the world itself. It was as if it wanted to turn illusory into reality, from an illusory state to reality. It was like the first thing a powerful cultivator from the bottom of heaven and earth would do when he crossed the space-time level to appear between heaven and earth. Seeing this, Shu Xi knew that this was the key. If this figure were to materialize, it would be a great disaster for her and her disciple. This was because this figure was not the real Luo Fan. Instead, it was an illusory existence formed by the projection of Luo Fan's shadow on the woman's mind. If the woman could destroy this kind of illusory existence with her own power, it would not affect her at all. She could easily endure it, and she might even obtain great benefits. However, now that Shu Xi had forcefully pulled out her mind, it was as if she had forcefully fused it with the woman's spirit power before pulling it out. The figure had gained corporeal form. Moreover, it had gained corporeal form from the woman's body. Once it turned illusory into reality and truly grew up to become a real living being, a real cultivator, it would naturally take the initiative to absorb the woman's spirit power, which was of the same lineage as itself. In fact, it might even absorb all of the spirit power, causing the woman's spirit to wither and die. It might even take a step further and absorb Shu Xi, who had caused it to separate from the woman's mind, as well. It would absorb her power, her spirit, and everything else. At that time, it would be a disaster for Shu Xi and the woman. If it was in the past, perhaps Shu Xi would not be able to see this clearly. However, after comprehending and improving over the years, her knowledge and experience had improved greatly. What she had obtained and what she knew was naturally much more than before. This was a fact that could be seen with a single glance. Therefore, at this moment, Shu Xi did not hesitate to urge her strongest power. She condensed rays of spiritual light and turned them into a platform. She forcefully smashed down on the figure that had just appeared in front of her. Although it was vastly different from the Luo Fan in her memory, its essence was inexplicably similar. At this moment, the surrounding endless heaven and earth began to tremble, and a variety of indescribable mysterious forces crossed the air and naturally condensed on the platform, condensed by the spirit light. Then, they brazenly smashed down on Luo Fan's figure. With this smash, the void trembled, and the endless world in front of the platform naturally moved away. There was no longer any obstruction between the platform and Luo Fan's figure, and there was no longer any power to stop it. Even the laws of heaven and earth naturally gave way at this moment. leaving the void for this platform. As a result, the platform seemed to have transcended time. The moment it appeared, it had already smashed into the figure's head. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying shockwave spread out in all directions from the point of contact. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding world had been shattered. This place, which was originally extremely harmonious and wonderful, was directly turned into a ruin that could not be cleaned up. At this moment, Shu Xi's disciple's body trembled, and she suddenly returned to her senses. However, as soon as she returned to her senses, she had already endured the extremely terrifying impact. Her body was like a fallen leaf that was instantly sent tens of thousands of light years away. At this moment, Shu Xi did not have the time to pay attention to her disciple who had been sent into such a sorry state. Instead, her pupils narrowed slightly. Her gaze was focused on the position that had appeared at the center of the shockwave. Her gaze was focused on the head that had been forcefully imprinted on by the platform, and a figure that had even been replaced by the platform. At this moment, the figure moved. With a slight grab, the platform had already broken free from Shu Xi's control. In an instant, it had turned from an item that she could control into an item without any owner that had nothing to do with her at all. Shortly after, the spiritual light platform suddenly collapsed, and a head appeared where the platform originally was, which was the neck of that figure. Seeing this, Shu Xi groaned inwardly. It must be said that although she knew that the figure in front of her would not be defeated so easily, after all, although it was not the real Luo Fan, it had come from Luo Fan. With Luo Fan's power, it was already extremely extraordinary even before she had separated from him. He could easily use her figure to display power that even surpassed her own, not to mention that Luo Fan had cultivated for so many years. However, even though she knew that the other party was not easy to deal with, she still felt that it was a little unacceptable that the other party had so easily taken away the method that she had polished for hundreds of thousands of years. At this moment, she let out a delicate shout, and the power in her body surged. Endless spirit light, endless thoughts, and endless power surged and gathered in a frenzy. At this moment, they were condensed in a frenzy towards Luo Fan's figure. In the blink of an eye, they had directly poured into the platform. At this moment, the platform released an extremely intense light, colliding with the spirit light, thoughts, and power that erupted from Shu Xi's body. There was a strong conflict between the two. Crackling sounds rang out continuously. The rumbling sounds did not stop either. All kinds of shock waves continued to spread in all directions. The surrounding space-time seemed to have turned into a rag, being casually rubbed and turned into all kinds of strange shapes. At this moment, Shu Xi's body seemed to have turned into a large guardian platform, directly connecting with the surrounding endless space-time. Its range was even 10 times larger than the area that a certain guardian platform protected before. Through this connection, the space-time that was connected to it naturally produced all kinds of indescribable mysterious power. They were constantly transferred through this extremely mysterious connection and continuously poured into Shu Xi's body, turning in her power, her means, and constantly strengthening the various powers that were constantly rushing into the platform. As she obtained this support, the power of her means skyrocketed. In the end, she finally broke through the various resistance released by the platform and directly poured into the platform. As the numerous methods poured into the platform began to buzz and tremble. This trembling made it impossible for Shu Xi to control the platform, but it also made it impossible for Luo Fan's figure to control the platform to do anything. At this point, Shu Xi did not stop moving. Light spread out from her body, and a long river rushed out from the top of her head. In a flash, it crossed space-time and rushed straight into the figure's head. It began to quickly spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already spread all over the figure's body, making it seem as if the long river had completely filled the figure's body. Along with this change, the figure's body slightly trembled. As it trembled, its control over the platform greatly weakened. This caused Shu Xi to directly seize control of the platform. Under her control, the platform trembled slightly and directly imprinted itself on the figure's chest. A boundlessly terrifying destructive power was released from the platform. This kind of power was the condensation of the power that the figure had poured into it. It was also the condensation of all the methods that Shu Si had mastered, as well as the endless mysterious power that she had obtained from the connections that she had established after traveling through large areas of this world over the years. This power was so strong that it was enough to destroy the world. Under this impact, the figure struggled with all its might and resisted with all its might. There were several times when it was about to be destroyed by the platform, but at the last moment, it condensed back and returned to its normal state. It was a pity that the figure was only formed from some of the woman's power. Although it contained endless mysteries, endless principles, and endless means, it was still limited by its own power. However, he was still restricted by his own level of power, so it was difficult for him to unleash it perfectly. In the end, the power that Shu Si had poured into its body worked together with the platform outside. In the end, with a muffled grunt, the figure suddenly exploded. All that was left in this world was a ruin that spanned several light years, and not a single trace of its existence remained. Shu Si only let out a sigh of relief when she saw the figure completely explode, leaving nothing behind. I didn't think that just a mark would be so powerful. Just how powerful is he? At that moment, such a thought flashed through her mind. The various shockwaves and chaos caused by the figure's explosion did not leave a single mark on her. Everything was like a gentle breeze that brushed past her without leaving a single trace. However, compared to the fact that the shockwaves did not affect her at all, her complexion did not look good either. On the contrary, her face had become extremely pale, as if she had suffered some sort of unbearable damage. The reason for this was very simple. Although the shockwaves did not affect her, they caused great damage to the world around her. It was not just the space within several light years that had been completely crushed into ruins. The world's power needed to continuously gather in order to recover. The hundreds of thousands of light years away and millions of light years away were actually affected by the shockwaves. At this moment, all sorts of indescribable tremors were occurring from deep within. It seemed to be in constant turmoil, and all sorts of subtle destruction was being produced within it at all times. For Shu Si, who could borrow the power of these areas, it would obviously be transferred to her, causing her to seem as if she had not been directly injured by the shockwaves. However, in reality, because of her connection with the world, she had received unimaginable damage from the shockwaves. At this moment, a scream came from afar. When Shu Si heard this, she knew that it was her disciple. She couldn't help but smile bitterly. Her figure flickered, and she directly crossed the chaotic space and appeared in the middle of the impact. She seemed to have turned into a fallen leaf that kept rolling in the impact. She couldn't help but appear beside the disciple, and a wave of energy directly enveloped the disciple. Compared to her, this disciple was only close to becoming a false saint. He did not have much ability to withstand the terrifying shockwaves caused by the endless world, space-time, and laws being shattered and chaotic. If she did not pay attention to him, he would definitely be severely injured by the shockwaves. His body might even be destroyed, and even his life might be affected. What happened just now? The woman originally felt that her life was about to end, but she was suddenly enveloped by a spiritual light. Then, she felt a sense of security that would not disappear even if the world was destroyed. She could not help but calm down. He turned his head and saw Shu Si, so he quickly asked, "It's just that you saw something you shouldn't have." Shu Si sighed. Hearing this, the woman was slightly at a loss. Just now, when Shu Si had grabbed Luo Fan's figure from her mind, she had also grabbed bits of memories from her mind at the same time. Therefore, at this moment, the woman could not remember what she had seen, nor could she remember what the image she had seen looked like. However, Shu Si did not completely erase Luo Fan's memory. She only dug out Luo Fan's figure. Therefore, after thinking for a while, the woman finally remembered that she had seen a certain figure, which caused everything that happened later. Her expression changed drastically, and she said, "Who is that? Why did I become like this just by seeing his image?" At this moment, the woman's body was already riddled with holes, and her body was in chaos. The power system, cultivation system, and cultivation path that had been established perfectly in his body no longer had any trace of what it had been before. It felt as if an iron rod had been inserted into her body and stirred crazily. This horrifying situation made her feel despair. If not for Shu Xi's existence, she might have been completely drowned in this despair. That's an old friend of mine. Back then, he was an existence that stood at the peak of the world before the rebirth of the world. Even the current me can't compare to a finger of his back then. Shu Xi sighed at this moment. In just a short conversation, Shu Xi had already crossed a distance of hundreds of millions of light years with the woman. They arrived outside the range of the chaotic impact and stood on a tall mountain. At a glance, the world seemed to have been completely torn apart and reconstructed. All sorts of indescribable light and shadows were constantly being born. An aura of annihilation that Shu Xi was extremely familiar with, but he had never felt after this world was reborn, surged over. Chapter 2189. Hearing Shu Xi's words, an inexplicable, complicated expression appeared on the woman's face. After all, she was already in existence that was close to the false saint stage. Although his understanding of cultivation and the situation couldn't reach Shu Xi's level, he was still much better than ordinary cultivators. She didn't know what was going on at the time, but in retrospect and with Shu Xi's explanation, she already understood what was going on. She knew why the figure she saw would cause her to almost die just now. The fundamental reason was that her own willpower was unable to withstand the endless mysteries and principles contained in that figure. Just the silhouette alone contained such inconceivable mysteries and principles. So it went without saying just how powerful the existence itself was at this moment. She no longer had any doubts about what Shu Xi had said before, that there were at least 1 billion existences that were stronger than her before the world was reborn. And it was precisely because she no longer had any doubts about this that she felt an unprecedented sense of reverence and anticipation for this world. Reverence was naturally because this world far exceeded her imagination, and the strength that the true powerhouses possessed was beyond the scope of her understanding. Moreover, she was looking forward to it because it meant that her future prospects might be many times better than what she had imagined. Suddenly, the woman's heart skipped a beat, and she asked Shu Xi, "Is that existence still alive?" "Of course he's alive. I'm still alive. So how could he die?" Shu Xi said without hesitation. When she said these words, she completely ignored what she had said before. She didn't mention how those experts who were more powerful than her had died in the billions. One had to know that if she was still alive, those powerhouses should be alive as well. However, it was obvious that the woman did not think so much because of the asymmetry of information. She only thought that there were at least 1 billion survivors that were more powerful than Shu Xi in this world, and that she had not discovered them before because they were hiding. For a moment, her face became even more shocked. "I see," the woman muttered and looked up at the sky, her eyes filled with longing. However, she quickly recalled her previous encounter. She no longer dared to look at the sky and could only lower her head. One must know that her current level was far too low compared to that existence. It would be fine if that existence didn't appear as she looked up at the sky. She wouldn't be injured because of it. However, if that existence were to suddenly appear, then he would once again fall into that horrifying scene from before. And this time, she did not know if Shu Xi would be able to help her in time. Under such circumstances, she naturally did not dare to court death. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, a soft sound came from all over the world. Amidst this soft sound, the master-disciple duo simultaneously felt the laws of law tremble. This kind of trembling meant that there were all sorts of vibrations everywhere in the world, and the impact of these laws had appeared just now. Combined with the booming sounds coming from all directions, the two of them instantly understood what was going on. "Looks like the unlucky ones aren't the only ones," the woman said to Shu Xi. Her tone was filled with gratitude. Evidently, even though Luo Fan appeared for an extremely short period of time, to the point that even the shortest time could not be used to describe the time he appeared. However, because the world was too vast and there were too many living beings, there were too many of them. At that moment, there were quite a number of living beings that saw his existence in the void. However, those creatures usually only cultivated on their own, comprehended the Tao on their own, and grew on their own. They didn't have a powerful expert like Shu Si by their side to protect them. In this way, they were naturally unable to endure the terrifying torrent of information that was ceaselessly released from the figure. In the end, the torrent of information caused their bodies to explode, their spirits to explode, and even their everything to explode. In the end, it caused a terrifying explosion that could shake the laws. This is also their own fate. Shu Si sighed inwardly. At the same time, she felt an indescribable sense of urgency from the bottom of her heart. One must know that almost all cultivators and living beings could not withstand the endless mysteries released by Luo Fan's figure. However, the world was so vast, and there were so many living beings. Perhaps there were living beings with special physiques or hearts that could turn the impossible into the possible and completely contain the terrifying impact that the figure released. And if there was a living being that could do this, then to them, this disaster would naturally turn into a great opportunity. In the end, it was only a conservative saying that one's cultivation realm improved by leaps and bounds. Perhaps in just a few years, the other party could directly surpass the limit and reach her level. Looks like the world is not going to be peaceful again. Shu Si sighed inwardly, and a trace of sorrow flashed across her eyes. Only by personally witnessing the entire process of the world's destruction could one truly understand the value of peace and the value of peace. Obviously, a powerhouse like Shu Si, who had witnessed the entire process with her own eyes, felt this the most. At this moment, even if she did not think that this disaster would affect her, she could not help but feel a sense of pity for the various disasters that this world was about to encounter. Master, did something happen again? The woman saw the change in Shu Si's expression and could not help but ask curiously. It's nothing. Shu Si naturally could not share this guess with her disciple. After all, even she could not solve this problem. Moreover, the cultivation realm of her disciple was almost insignificant compared to her. If she said it, it would only add to her worries. The woman naturally knew that her master was hiding something, but it was obvious that as her disciple, she could not and did not have the ability to force Shu Si to say something that she did not want to say. Therefore, at this moment, she could only listen obediently and nod. I comprehended some things from the imprint just now. Come with me. I will teach it to you. Shu Si did not care about the changes in the woman's heart and only said that to her. As she spoke, she casually pulled the woman into the void, into the dojo that she had opened up herself. What she said just now was not empty talk. Her cultivation realm and comprehension ability were clearly not something that her disciple could compare to. In that instant, when she fought with the figure that Luo Fan left in her disciple's body, although it was only a few short breaths, in the end, she had already comprehended many things that she had not comprehended before and obtained many mysteries that she had not obtained before. These mysteries were extremely profound and wonderful. Even to Shu Si, they had a special effect and could give her quite a lot of inspiration, let alone to the woman. It could be said that to her, this sort of profoundness was a remarkable ability that she had not come into contact with before. It could bring about a tremendous change to her strength. Luo Fan didn't care about the astonishing changes that his figure had caused to the world when he appeared. At this moment, he was hidden in the void, and his body was covered by layers of barriers that belonged to that plane. It could be said that he was completely isolated from reality. It was precisely because of this isolation that the connection between him and the great Tao of chaos, which seemed to be an endless river, was isolated as much as possible. It was also because of this isolation that the information that he received from the chaotic Tao was finally reduced to a range that he could barely endure. As a result, not only did he not explode from the existence of the chaotic Tao, But his cultivation realm had also improved greatly during this process. This allowed his understanding of the world and the chaotic Tao that he had simulated to make great progress. At this moment, his entire body contained boundless profundities. It was because his body had been imbued with all sorts of indescribable, profound principles and boundless information. This represented his cultivation realm, his strength, and all aspects of his body had improved greatly. It also represented another point, which was that his power, the profundities that he had comprehended, and his control over his own power had fallen to the lowest point in a long time. The reason for this was not complicated. It was because the grand Tao of chaos was truly too profound, too profound. The boundless principles and profundities contained within it had all arrived at a peak that he could not even imagine. It was precisely because of this that even if he passed through layers of isolation, even if he was weakening the information he obtained from the chaotic Tao at every single moment, he was still exhausted. He was still unable to perfectly absorb all the information, causing the information to naturally seep into his body, his strength, and his life essence. In the end, it transformed into profundities that he was unable to control, causing his body to constantly release all sorts of profound principles and information, and any living being would be affected by it. This situation was naturally not a bad thing. After all, he was constantly obtaining profundities, and principles during this process. If this was a bad thing, then it was simply showing off after obtaining an advantage. But at the same time, it wasn't a good thing. After all, he wasn't trying to comprehend all the profundities of the world and the world created by the tribulations, nor was he trying to obtain all the principles within the chaotic Tao. Instead, he was trying to use this process to break through this world, surpass this world, and break free from this world. Only in this way would he be able to break through the fifth tribulation, break through the barrier he was currently facing, and take another step towards his goal of becoming a true saint. With such a goal in mind, his current situation was clearly not a good thing. After all, the profundities that had seeped into his body, his strength, and his life essence could be said to not belong to him. If he wanted to truly absorb it, then he had to spend a certain amount of time and energy to refine it once more, and he had to completely fuse it into his Tao of cultivation and his view of the world. If he couldn't complete this final step, then these principles and profundities wouldn't be able to truly transform into his strength, and they wouldn't be able to truly become resources for his advancement. It was even to the extent that they might become a burden to him instead, and it would greatly or slightly affect his speed of advancement. Obviously, if there was a limit to the profundities he had comprehended, then these profundities and principles would stop fusing with him after a certain period of time. If he was given space and time to digest and absorb them, then the fusion of these profundities and principles would naturally have the opportunity to transform into his strength and become resources for his growth. But that wasn't the case. After all, the river that existed below was the chaotic Tao. It was the chaotic Tao that existed behind the state of chaos, or at least behind a certain layer of the state of chaos, and it was the chaotic Tao that controlled everything in that layer of chaos. Could the profundities and principles contained within it possibly be limited? Even if the chaotic Tao before him was only a simulation of the fifth tribulation, didn't the fifth tribulation also come from the state of chaos? How could the chaotic Tao that it simulated not possess the infinite characteristics that the true chaotic Tao possessed? In other words, with Luo Fan's current strength and current trend of development, even if he waited until the end of time, even if he waited until the fifth tribulation reached the limit of time, it would still be impossible for him to completely absorb the profundities and principles within it. In other words, it was completely impossible for him to take out enough time and energy to digest these profundities and principles that had voluntarily fused with his body, life source, strength, and everything else. In this way, the outcome was very obvious. If he continued like this, he would eventually perish and be destroyed along with this world. With such an outcome, This situation clearly didn't seem like a good thing no matter how one looked at it. At this moment, Luo Fan was in a state of pain and happiness. He absorbed the various profundities and principles within the chaotic Tao, analyzed the various information within, and worked hard to reduce the profundities and information that he needed to digest in the future. Chapter 2190. In the face of such a never-ending cycle, Luo Fan naturally could not allow it to continue. Ever since he realized that there was no future for him to develop, he had started to think of a way to break this endless cycle. He had tried his best to think of a way to surpass this world and the chaotic Tao. It must be known that the chaotic Tao was an unbelievable existence. It couldn't be more obvious. It went without saying how difficult it was to surpass such an unbelievable existence. Therefore, even after thinking about it for so many years, he didn't gain much. He could only do his best to strengthen the layers of protection around him, strengthen the isolation of the layers of protection from the chaotic Tao, and reduce the amount of information that the chaotic Tao was constantly pouring into his body. As for why he had suddenly revealed himself and was seen by Shu Si's disciple, the reason was very simple. It was because when he was adjusting the layer barrier, the information from the chaotic Grand Tao had seized the opportunity when a subtle flaw appeared and poured into his body, causing him to lose his balance for a moment. In the end, it allowed him to break through the countless layers of the barrier, and in the end, he was seen by Shu Si's disciple. Luo Fan constantly pondered, trying hard to find a way to cut off this cycle. His mind was constantly flashing with countless mysterious principles and countless mysterious methods, which constantly emerged from the bottom of his heart, but under the endless impact, they constantly collapsed. Although there were many methods, all of them had flaws, big or small. Even the strongest of these methods could only last for a short period of time and slightly delay the advancement of this cycle. Therefore, he was naturally not satisfied with this result. Time gradually passed. 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. Unknowingly, another millions of years had passed. In the past millions of years, the situation of this world had once again undergone earth-shattering changes. The peaceful scene from millions of years ago had completely disappeared from this world. Millions of years ago, when Luo Fan's figure appeared in the sky, there were actually many living beings that saw him. Among them, almost all of them had exploded due to the endless mysteries and information contained in his figure, dying without a burial. Only a few of them were left. Not only did they not die in the process, but they had also absorbed enough nutrients from Luo Fan's figure, allowing their knowledge to grow tremendously. In the following years, this kind of growth gradually transformed into his cultivation and strength, causing his strength to continuously increase. In the end, one after another, he broke through layers of realms and entered the level that surpassed the false saint realm. These living beings were just living beings born after the rebirth of this world. For them, even if their knowledge had become vast because of the mysteries contained in Luo Fan's figure, it could not change the disadvantage of not having a complete inheritance. Therefore, after surpassing the false saint realm, they had already unknowingly developed a feeling that they were invincible. There were no living beings in this world and no cultivators that could resist them. With this feeling, their ambitions were naturally born. Driven by this kind of ambition, they began to establish their forces and began to promote the expansion of their forces. They continued to conquer more and more regions, gradually causing the entire world to fall into more and more chaos. However, although this chaos was gradually approaching the tragic scene of the quagmire of war caused by the pseudo-heavenly Tao back then, all living beings that sensed this chaos, including Shu Si, did not feel any sense of danger. Because of it, they did not start to predict with an extremely pessimistic tone that this world would be completely transformed or even destroyed. The scale was similar, but the feeling it gave people was completely different, causing Shu Si, who was paying attention to all of this, to be secretly shocked. However, Shu Si was Shu Si after all. After improving so much, her deduction ability had also increased to an unimaginable level. This enhancement allowed her to quickly figure out the root of all this. She knew what had caused such a similar scale of war, yet gave rise to a completely different kind of anomaly. The reason for this was because there was no heavenly Tao in this world. Instead, it was controlled by the legendary Great Tao that even she could not comprehend now. The heavenly Tao and Great Tao seemed to be quite similar on the surface. They both seemed to control this world and maintain it. However, on a more subtle level, the Great Tao and the heavenly Tao were on two completely different levels. The difference between the two was so great that it was a little conservative to say that it was like the difference between heaven and earth. Putting everything else aside, the will that was derived from the heavenly Tao actually had the thoughts of living beings and could actually think like living beings. It could even communicate with other living beings like living beings. This point alone was enough to show some clues. One must know that this was an existence that could control this world. If such an existence had a will, it should be at the level of the world's will. In other words, the way of thinking was completely different from living beings. In fact, it could not even communicate with living beings at all, let alone using words to interact with each other. In comparison, the Great Tao was obviously different. If the Great Tao gave birth to a will, even if it was not the world's will, it would definitely reach the level of the world's will. And under that level, the power that the Great Taos will possess had already reached the level of a true divine. In other words, it could completely ignore all existences below the true divine level. It was a powerful existence that did not even care about the number of existences below the true divine level and the methods they used to combine their powers. This completely different structure had obviously resulted in one result. That was, the level of the heavenly Tao was many times lower than the Great Tao. Such a difference in level had caused such a situation to occur in this world. The terrifying war that could cause the entire world to fall into a quagmire of war, when it was under the control of the heavenly Tao and caused the world to fall into the abyss of destruction, was easily withstood by the world at this moment. In fact, even if the war was countless times stronger, it would not be enough to shake the world. Under such circumstances, the battle between the experts in this part of the world became even more intense. They no longer had anything to worry about when they fought. Almost every time they fought, they would send tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions of lives onto the battlefield. The terrifying explosions of power would even turn the wondrous lands of the Spirit Mountains into ruins. The treasures that could allow countless living beings to cultivate and gain the ability to gain initial control over their own fates were either used up or destroyed in the battles. This process developed for millions of years, but there were already more than a dozen incomparably huge forces established in this world. The locations of these forces were roughly in the center of this world. They were all connected to each other. Among them, every force had enemies and friends. The wars between each force and the other forces had also turned from extremely simple or purely because they could not stand the sight of such a situation to entanglement of interests. As a result, the attacks between each other became more and more exciting. The rulers of these dozen or so forces weren't the kind of experts who didn't die because they saw a Luo fan's figure. Among them, there were experts that did not rely on any other experts in this world and did not rely on any other gifts to grow. Compared to the experts who had obtained information about Luo fan's figure, these experts had an incomparably solid foundation. Even among the many forces, they appeared much weaker than the leaders of the other forces because they did not have a master. However, by sticking together, they could maintain their own existence and the integrity of their forces under the watchful eyes of the many experts. Although there were strong and weak powerhouses among the powerhouses, the strongest one was only equivalent to a supreme Emperor powerhouse. Not to mention, compared to Shu Si, even compared to Shu Si's disciple, who had already made significant breakthroughs, they actually did not have much of an advantage. It was precisely because of this that Shu Si appeared so calm at this moment. She even had the time to think about the fundamental reason why this world would behave in such a completely different manner under the same threat of war. After all, no matter how large the scale of this war became, no matter how powerful the impact, no matter how many living beings died, to her, it was just something that she could suppress with a single slap. In this case, why would she care about this kind of war caused by these living beings? As expected, the heavenly Tao is not necessary. In fact, the heavenly Tao itself is the burden of this world. Without the heavenly Tao, the development of this world would become even more perfect, and the level of the world would also become higher. As this thought flashed through Shu Xi's mind, her eyes seemed to penetrate the infinite void, as if she wanted to deeply engrave a figure that did not exist in her heart. Even ordinary cultivators who had just stepped onto the path of cultivation would know about the phenomenon of the heaven-man connection, let alone a terrifying existence like Shu Xi, who was already a third or fourth tribulation expert. The tragic war that had arisen in this world could even be compared to the quagmire of war that had been born under the control of the heavenly axiom. The number of living beings that had died was so great that the negative emotions that had been released during this process were so great that it went without saying how vast their power was. In this way, this power would naturally affect the world to a certain extent under the heaven-man connection, and even change the state of the entire world. Even the great Tao of chaos, which seemed to be eternally motionless, unchanging and unchanging, seemed to have changed slightly due to this influence before this. Even though the war had been going on for millions of years, Luo Fan did not react at all because of the changes in the world. But this time, when the accumulation of the countless living beings was enough to slightly change the great Tao of chaos, he suddenly woke up from that state of absolute immersion. The great Tao of chaos has changed, he murmured. His eyes flickered with an indescribable light, and there seemed to be lightning constantly echoing in his heart. At this moment, he had suddenly grasped the clue that he had been trying to grasp for so many years. If I change the great Tao of chaos, or even cause it to become abnormal, or even break, then I will have the chance to transcend this cycle and transcend this world. Luo Fan thought to himself, and an indescribable excitement flashed through his eyes. Obviously, he could not use brute force to change the great Tao of chaos. After all, it was the great Tao of chaos. It was an existence that even a true saint might not be able to fully comprehend, and even a true saint seemed extremely insignificant before it. If he wanted to use brute force to change such an existence, then the level of brute force should at least surpass the true saint realm. Obviously, even if Luo Fan had improved a lot compared to before, it was impossible for him to surpass the true saint realm. Even if the great Tao of chaos before him was only a simulation of the fifth calamity, it was definitely not an existence that Luo Fan could change with brute force. Therefore, the only way to change the great Tao of chaos was to borrow the power of the world itself. Only this kind of power could resist the great Tao of chaos, and only then would he have the chance to tear the great Tao of chaos apart, transcend this calamity, and transcend this calamity. He had thought of this before, but he could not find any way to carry it out. After all, this was such a vast world. If he wanted to use cultivation techniques, divine abilities, and power to mobilize the power of the world, even if it was a little easier than mobilizing the power of the great Tao of chaos, it was definitely not that easy. However, the situation of the world and the slight change in the great Tao of chaos had already solved the problem that troubled him the most. Countless pieces of information flashed through Luo Fan's mind, allowing him to confirm his next move in the blink of an eye. At that moment, his heart moved slightly, and a spiritual light clone separated from his body. After the doppelganger was created, its body began to swell. In a trance, there seemed to be an endless amount of information pouring into its body in a frenzy, as if it was going to completely explode. Seeing this, Luo Fan waved his hand, and a blade light shot out from his hand. In a flash, it stabbed into the spiritual light clone's body and exploded. As the blade light exploded, the eyes of the spiritual light clone gradually dimmed. It was as if some kind of power had suddenly cut off its intelligence and potential. Along with this change, the information that was constantly pouring into the spiritual light clone gradually decreased. The spiritual light clone began to shrink gradually. After a while, the psionic light doppelganger had completely returned to its normal appearance. It looked just like Luo Fan before he fell into the endless loop, except for the difference in the depth of his eyes. Chapter 2192. This force was only at the bottom among the many forces. The cultivation of its leader was not even comparable to Shu Ci's. However, no matter what level it was among the many forces, being able to become the ruler of a large force meant that the power it controlled was unimaginably terrifying. This way, the prosperity and mysteriousness of this force's headquarters were self-evident. At this moment, what appeared before Luo Fan's spirit light clone was a terrifying country that was as vast as a large world. In this country, the resources of hundreds of large worlds were gathered. It seemed extremely glorious, extremely vast, and even more so, it was filled with endless mysteries and contained boundless power. Inside, there were countless cultivators cultivating and building. There were also tens of billions of soldiers on standby in this country. Rays of light shrouded this country, and endless power flowed endlessly inside the country. The countless space-time and worlds that made up everything in the world turned into a source of power in this country, providing endless and never-ending power for the perfect operation of this country. When Luo Fan's spirit light clone arrived, he immediately discovered the core of this country and the powerhouse that couldn't even compare to Shu Ci. After seeing this, the spirit light clone didn't hesitate at all. He took a step forward, and the surrounding space-time began to distort crazily. In the end, after a flash, the spirit light clone crossed a distance of who knows how many billions of light years and appeared before the powerhouse. This expert occupied an area that was as vast as a great thousand worlds. His body had transformed into all living things in this world, and he was cultivating according to some mysterious method. The moment Luo Fan arrived, he triggered a huge change in the entire country. He even triggered a violent reaction from the Great Thousand World. Boo! An angry roar came from the Great Thousand World. It was like a huge roar that rolled toward Luo Fan, and the sound of thunder poured into his eardrums. This kind of sound, it sounded as if it was really released by a part of the world. The heaven and earth embodiment cultivation technique is not bad when you haven't reached this realm. But now is not the right time, Luo Fan's spirit light avatar said. As he spoke, an indescribable fluctuation was released from his body. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the Great Thousand World before him. All connections between this Great Thousand World and the outside world were instantly severed, turning this Great Thousand World into a completely independent world where no information or power could be transmitted. This change instantly shocked the expert who had transformed into the Great Thousand World. The Great Thousand World started to rapidly shrink. Although this speed of shrinking was extremely fast compared to Luo Fan's reaction, it was still insignificant. It would not be an exaggeration to say that if Luo Fan wanted to, he could easily wipe out the cultivators standing before him. However, with Luo Fan's confidence, it was impossible for him to do such a thing at this moment. At this moment, he just looked indifferently at the changes in the Great Thousand World before him. It was only after the Great Thousand World had completely shrunk into a middle-aged man, an extremely mighty and solemn man with shock and confidence in his eyes, that he faintly said, "Look, if I want to make a move just now, you would have died hundreds of millions of times." Hearing this, the middle-aged man's expression became even more unsightly. "Who the hell are you?" he said through gritted teeth. Hearing this, a strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. "Is this important? Who am I that can change the fact that you can't resist at all? Why do you care so much about who I am?" The dignified middle-aged man furrowed his brows. "I can't resist at all in front of you." As he spoke, he suddenly raised his hand and made a grabbing motion in the air. A scepter appeared in his hand. Immediately after, he suddenly slammed the scepter in the air, and the vast space-time that was the size of the Great Thousand World collapsed in an instant. All the time, space and heaven and earth in this area released an unimaginable power at this moment. It gathered into a wave and began to sweep in all directions, colliding with the wave that covered the area and completely sealed off the inside and outside of this area. With the appearance of this impact, the layer of wave created by Luo Fan seemed to have turned into a calm surface of water with a huge stone thrown into it. Ripples began to appear one after another. Wave after wave of ripples continued to spread and overlap on the surface of the wave, gradually becoming more and more obvious. In the end, it was completely revealed, completely covering the light and shadows of the outside world that could still be seen. However, even at this stage, the isolation layer formed by the wave still existed. It still displayed its incredible effect, completely separating this area from everything in the outside world. All information and power could not be transmitted from the outside world. The middle-aged man had an extremely shocked expression on his face, and there was a faint flash of disbelief in the depths of his eyes. Impossible. Even a heavenly king can't withstand my attack without being shaken. He muttered and raised his hand to slam the scepter in his hand again. With this pause, the surrounding space-time and the destruction of the world became even more terrifying. Under this destruction, even more terrifying waves began to be released from the end of the scepter, blasting in all directions in an even more ferocious manner. Moreover, at this time, these fluctuations were no longer just the appearance of those fluctuations. Instead, they began to transform into all kinds of special forms, such as all kinds of strange space-time, indescribable creatures, or indescribable forms of attack. They frantically rushed towards the fluctuations that separated them from the outside world. However, those ripples didn't waver in the slightest and didn't show any changes due to the impact. They were still the same ripples that were constantly flickering. In the end, after the waves of impact subsided, everything returned to its original state, as if nothing had happened. Luo Fan was still quietly floating there. The ripples that he had constructed were still perfectly isolated from the outside world. Only the space-time inside had become incomparably broken, and the endless heavens and earth had almost been completely destroyed. Even the laws that originally restricted everything and wove all laws had become chaotic at this moment. As for the dignified middle-aged man in the center, he had already become sluggish, as if he had seen something that completely overturned his worldview. Now, I think you should know how big the gap between you and me is, right? Luo Fan looked at the dignified middle-aged man and said faintly, "No, you must have eliminated all your offensive abilities in exchange for such a terrifying defensive ability. You can't do anything to me at all." The middle-aged man had already become somewhat hysterical at this moment. After all, it went without saying that he had put in a lot of effort to achieve such achievements and status in the past millions of years. The strength of the confidence that he had accumulated had reached an unimaginable level. In such a situation, he saw that all of his means were unable to even shake the opponent's casual means. In front of his opponent, his image, which was originally high and mighty in front of all living beings, had actually become so lowly and insignificant. His mentality finally lost balance, and the state of mind that he had accumulated for millions of years was instantly shattered. It was precisely because of this that he became hysterical and lost his rationality when he received such an impact. Of course, this was actually also very normal. After all, it had only been millions of years since he was born until now. The pressure on his spirit and state of mind to obtain such terrifying power in such a short period of time was ultimately too great. In other words, although he had accumulated such a powerful cultivation base in such a short period of time, his state of mind was greatly lagging behind. As a result, he was naturally slightly stimulated, and his power became slightly chaotic, causing his state of mind to become chaotic as well. If he had been a protector like before the rebirth of the world, the situation would obviously be completely different. After all, Any protector who could cultivate from zero all the way to obtain the position of a protector had to put in countless efforts, experience countless dangers, and spend billions of years to achieve it. With so much effort and such a long period of time, even if he originally had no talent in the cultivation of the state of mind, it was enough to accumulate his state of mind to an unimaginable height. If such a protector took the position of this middle-aged man, even if he could not win against Luo Fan, even if Luo Fan would be able to get rid of him more easily, he would definitely not become hysterical and lose his rationality after such a small setback in his mind. Therefore, being fast had its advantages, and being slow had its advantages. Luo Fan stood there quietly, an indescribable expression on his face, and an indescribable pity appeared in his eyes. It's a pity that he's already useless. He sighed and changed his original thoughts. Originally, he planned to use this middle-aged man as his puppet, and let him replace him to carry out the various methods that he originally planned to do to this world. If not for that, why would he be so bored as to appear here and wait for this middle-aged man to launch all sorts of attacks and display all sorts of methods to struggle? However, from the looks of it now, this person's mind was really too weak. If he really placed the plan on him, the final result would be that the plan would probably be carried out to a certain stage, and the final result would be that the plan would directly be destroyed from top to bottom. In the end, I can only do it myself. He sighed inwardly and casually grabbed towards the middle-aged man in front of him. When he grabbed, it was as if he did not use any power at all and was simply grabbing toward that direction. However, just as he made a grabbing motion, his palm directly entered the void and completely disappeared from this world. Or rather, it disappeared from this plane of reality. Immediately after, the middle-aged man's body trembled, and his entire body began to gradually become illusory. From his original appearance that was absolutely real, it did not take long for him to completely become illusory, and in the end he disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there. At the same time, within this area, the various changes caused by the middle-aged man gradually began to fade. The originally destroyed space-time, the world, and the laws that were disturbed gradually recovered during this process, as if all the changes that had happened before had never happened. In fact, at this moment, within the forces that the middle-aged man controlled, the memories of the middle-aged man's subordinates began to blur, as if there was a layer of fog shrouding those memories. In the end, I still can't achieve the state of chaos. Looking at the various changes around him, Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. What he did just now was not anything else, but directly reaching his palm into the conceptual plane, directly grabbing the middle-aged man's concept of existence, and with a shake, completely shattering the middle-aged man's concept of existence. Because each plane corresponded to each other, before they could communicate and transform, the disappearance of any one of them would cause the middle-aged man to lose his life, and he would completely disappear. Therefore, the disappearance of the concept of existence naturally caused the middle-aged man in this plane of reality to gradually disappear. Of course, in the other planes, the middle-aged man's corresponding existences were the same, and they also gradually disappeared due to this change, and the disappearance of the corresponding existences of the living beings in different planes would cause somewhat different results. In the conceptual plane, the disappearance of the concept of existence would cause all the phenomena that were affected by the middle-aged man to disappear along with him. In other words, the things destroyed by the middle-aged man would be restored, the living beings killed by the middle-aged man would be revived, the forces that the middle-aged man established would collapse, and all the living beings that remembered the middle-aged man would completely lose all memories related to him. Of course, this was only the most perfect change. The specific impact would be based on the ability of the person who attacked, the person's understanding of the conceptual plane, and the degree of destruction of the concept of existence. Just like now, Luo Fan had casually shattered the middle-aged man's concept of existence, causing it to completely disappear. However, most of the effects caused by the middle-aged man still existed. The memories of the living beings that remembered the middle-aged man were only shrouded by the fog and became blurry, but they did not completely disappear. As for the forces that he established, they naturally still existed. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved it. The fluctuations that no longer had any ripples around this area instantly disappeared, and all the communication between this area and the outside world was instantly reestablished. As this communication was reestablished, streaks of light quickly rushed over from the outside world. Waves of fluctuations and waves of killing intent kept surging towards Luo Fan's location. As a force that was so huge that even its headquarters was a vast country, there was naturally no need to mention how strict its structure was. Now that the middle-aged man suddenly disappeared, this naturally triggered a series of changes. Even if the memories of the middle-aged man suddenly became blurry, the powerhouses that originally had a close relationship with the middle-aged man would still take action due to this series of changes and come to where Luo Fan was to eliminate the influence he had on this force. Audacious Taoist, how dare you invade our country? You're courting death. Furious roars came from all directions, and this area seemed to have darkened due to this change. Even the sky seemed to have been covered by dark clouds at this moment. Waves of killing intent were like maggots in a tarsal bone, tightly entangling Luo Fan's spirit light clone. As time passed, more and more powerhouses took action. Even the army was mobilized and quickly rushed towards where Luo Fan was. Looking at such a rapid change, Luo Fan's face did not show any fear. On the contrary, there was an inexplicable smile on his face, as if he had seen a change that made him feel extremely surprised. There are actually such elites here. In that case, my plan will have a greater chance of success. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind. The countless living beings in front of him, the terrifying killing intent, and even the world-shaking army that could destroy large swathes of the world were nothing more than ants to him. Not to mention anything else, if he wanted to, he only needed to use the concept level to completely wipe out all of them. Under such circumstances, he naturally could not feel any fear because of the arrival of these powerhouses and the arrival of these armies. Come on, let me see how far you can go. Looking at the many powerhouses, Luo Fan's heart moved and such a thought flashed through his mind. Chapter 2193. In the endless space-time, in the endless heaven and earth, almost all of them possessed intelligent life forms and cultivators. However, because they were separated from the outside world by countless layers, there was a huge gap in terms of levels. This was why almost no cultivators could transcend the world and descend to this world. However, this did not mean that the living beings here were weak. In fact, if the living beings grew up in this world, who knew how many of them would be able to fight against the leaders of the various forces in this world? And at this time, what Luo Fan did was to break the barrier between levels, directly allowing those cultivators who could not transcend their levels and descend to this side of the world to transcend time and space and descend to this side of the world. Of course, when they broke through and descended, they needed a carrier made of endless space-time. It was just like how Luo Fan had to absorb endless space-time to construct his body and everything else when he transcended from the bottom layer of space-time and descended to this world. As for those carriers, if they were single beings, they would naturally be able to use the endless space around them to construct themselves. However, it was clear that the number of living beings that were flying out from each world was innumerable. The number of living beings that were flying out from each world numbered in the hundreds of millions. Under such circumstances, even if there was endless space-time in the surroundings, it was impossible to use it to make up for the countless creatures that needed it. If it was under normal circumstances, this restriction would obviously make it impossible for Luo Fan's method to succeed. But it was clear that the current situation was not normal. The one who guided all of these changes wasn't some other creature or cultivator, but Luo Fan. In that instant, when he opened up the space-time, he had already set up layers of mysterious barriers in front of the numerous space-time passages. The moment the creatures passed through these barriers, they would directly give them an illusory space-time, allowing them to descend to this world that simulated the state of chaos under the support of the illusory space-time. Of course, because they were only supported by the illusory space-time, these living beings were at least a level weaker than the living beings that were born and bred in this world. Moreover, because they were essentially illusory, the amount of time they could exist for would be extremely short. At most, they would only last for a few years before they would collapse and perish. Unless they were able to attain an indescribable fortuitous encounter through unimaginable hard work, turning the illusory into reality, and condensing their illusory foundation into reality. Only then would they be able to truly transcend the world at the bottom and descend into the world at the top. Clearly, there was no telling if there was even one such being in the billions of billions. Therefore, among the billions of living beings before him, there were very few who could truly live for a long time. However, Luo Fan was clearly not doing this to give the creatures at the bottom of the world a chance to transcend, but to test the quality of the members of this force. Since that was the case, this kind of creature with an illusory foundation was more than enough. At this moment, the numerous creatures continuously rushed towards the cultivators and engaged in an extremely fierce battle with them. This kind of battle was even more tragic than the battle between this force and the other forces. With regards to this sudden slaughter, the powerhouses of this force's army simply couldn't figure out the reason behind it, much less the meaning of all this slaughter. It was as if they were being controlled by an invisible hand. They only knew to unleash all of their potential and engage in an increasingly intense battle with the endless terrifying creatures that came from nowhere. In this process, their potential was displayed incisively and vividly, allowing Luo Fan to gradually understand the many powerhouses and armies in this force more and more. Just like that, after a few years, Luo Fan had already obtained everything he wanted to know. With a thought, he casually waved his hand, and the countless creatures that were endlessly rushing out from the bottom of the space-time suddenly converged, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. Everything in the surroundings became clear, as if the incomparably tragic battle from before had never happened. It was so much so that even the traces left behind by the battle and the life forms that died in the battle had been completely restored. This strange change made the experts dumbfounded and somewhat at a loss for what to do. They had clearly fought against that strange opponent for several years, and countless of their companions had perished in the process. Why had everything become completely different in the blink of an eye? Even those who had died had completely recovered? If that was the case, was the battle before real or just an illusion? Was it a dream or was it reality? Given the current situation, it was naturally impossible for Luo Fan to subdue this force with just words alone. Even if these experts were nothing in Luo Fan's eyes and could only be considered as ants, they were still rather extraordinary experts on an absolute level. It went without saying that such experts had a firm will. Even if he presented the facts, reasoned with them, and laid out the real benefits, it might not be able to change their minds and thoughts, let alone just words. Therefore, at this moment, what Luo Fan wanted to do was to subdue them from a different perspective. An incomparably powerful might instantly envelop the heavens and earth. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped all the living beings and all the experts in this region within this might. The moment they were enveloped by this power, all the powerhouses instantly understood that they were nothing more than ants. Their lives were in the hands of some existence. If it was anyone else, they would have used threats and temptations to change the minds of these experts and subdue them. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not an ordinary expert. To him, not only was communicating with these creatures exhausting and fruitless, he could not even guarantee that they would be of the same mind as him. Naturally, he was unwilling to do so. Immediately, with a thought, an indescribable ripple swept through the region, and even the entire kingdom that was as vast as the heavens and earth. It directly enveloped all the living beings within, instantly pulling them into the ripple and directly enduring the invasion of the ripple. In the blink of an eye, the ripple had already seeped into their bodies, deep into their hearts, souls, and the source of their lives. After doing this, Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and the many waves began to undergo subtle changes. These subtle changes were so complicated that they could not be described with words. If the subtle changes were spread out, it would even be enough to make any Supreme Emperor's body collapse and die from the complicated changes. As he moved, the bodies of all living beings in the area began to tremble slightly. Their souls also experienced all sorts of indescribable changes as a result of this trembling. In just a few breaths' time, Luo Fan had already ended this method. He instantly withdrew the waves that had completely enveloped the countless creatures in the entire kingdom. As he put it away, all of the living beings prostrated themselves in his direction and called him sovereign. At this moment, all the creatures' eyes were filled with extreme fervor, as if Luo Fan was their highest belief and the most supreme existence in their hearts. In just a few breaths' time, Luo Fan had completely changed the hearts of all the creatures in the entire kingdom, causing all the creatures to prostrate themselves at his feet in the most pious manner. Faced with this expected change, Luo Fan did not seem very excited. At this moment, he only nodded and conveniently arranged different positions for the many powerful beings based on the results of his previous tests, giving them a place that was more suitable for their potential. With the completion of these new arrangements, the atmosphere of the entire force changed. Indistinctly, the force seemed to have become more agile, more energetic, and more valiant. After completing this, Luo Fan only said this and sent the many powerful beings away. Go on, conquer the entire world for me. A truly perfect system will be able to operate perfectly even if any link was missing. This was even more so for a system and a faction. Even if there was no ruler or leader, as long as everyone in the organization was in the most suitable position, as long as everyone could perfectly carry out their tasks within the scope of their responsibilities, then the organization and system would continue to operate perfectly. In fact, it might even operate even more smoothly because of the lack of constraints. This was just like the faction that Luo Fan had conquered. Although Luo Fan was not interested in participating and allowed the many living beings in this faction to act on their own, he only gave them an overall policy. However, this alone was enough to make the entire faction move like an incomparably perfect machine. In the end, this machine began to expand crazily in all directions like an incomparably huge war machine. The small forces that could have been a hindrance to this force in the past were easily crushed in an instant after this force perfectly displayed its potential. Their territories and resources were all absorbed by this force without any reservation. Instead, it became the driving force for this force to further expand. Just like this, small factions were conquered one after another. In just a few years, this faction had already increased its territory to 10 times its original size. In the extremely vast land and ocean, all sorts of mysterious and subtle auras were constantly released. These auras continuously condensed on Luo Fan, who was in the center of this faction. It was like a layer of mist lingering around his body, constantly protecting his body and making the connection between him and this region even tighter. Sure enough, it was worth it to waste some time doing that. Sensing that this extremely perfect war machine was continuously operating and devouring more and more resources, Luo Fan was inwardly satisfied. In fact, although several years had passed. However, other than the first sentence that Luo Fan Spirit Light clone said, "Go, conquer the entire world for me," no other instructions were given out. Everything that happened in the next few years was actually the result of the independent planning, decisions, and actions of the powerhouses in this faction. The surrounding major forces began to feel bewildered by the changes in this force. Back then, they all knew that there seemed to be some internal strife within this faction, causing this faction to be in a precarious situation and almost be overthrown at any time. At that time, they all even had plans in their hearts, waiting for this faction to truly erupt with internal strife and become chaotic. After all, if this faction became chaotic, they could take advantage of the opportunity and find a chance to devour this faction. However, before they could do anything, This faction seemed to have been injected with chicken blood and began to frantically expand in all directions. Moreover, it actually achieved unprecedented success. It was as if it had simply changed into a completely different faction. If this continues, the situation will be quite bad. A ruler of a certain faction murmured with a rather unsightly expression. To be able to climb to such a position, it was impossible for an expert to merely have a strong cultivation base and a high level of attainment. Although cultivation and cultivation were extremely important prerequisites, if one did not have the corresponding wisdom and scheming, it would be impossible. Therefore, the ruler of this faction clearly knew that the target of this faction that Luo Fan had conquered was actually them. Therefore, the ruler of this force clearly knew that the target of this force conquered by Luo Fan was actually them. Let's strike first and gain the upper hand. Let's make the first move. An indescribable sense of inspiration flowed into the cultivator's heart, allowing him to instantly understand many things. It turned out that he wasn't the only one who had been on guard. The rulers of the other factions were also intensely vigilant. That made sense. How could someone who could last so long against be weak? With this thought in mind, the ruler's eyes lit up. In the blink of an eye, he understood what he needed to do. He had fought against the rulers of the other factions for so long that even if he didn't understand them as well as he understood himself, he was at least at a level that few could match. Under these circumstances, all he needed to do was put himself in their shoes and figure out how his opponents would coordinate with him. He also needed to figure out what he needed to do to combine their attacks and unleash the greatest power possible. In just a few days, the various factions began to move simultaneously. Army after army was mobilized, pouncing on the faction that Luo Fan had conquered. These armies were the vanguards of the other factions. They were truly sharp knives, so there was no need to elaborate on how elite they were. It could be said that distance and space-time were no obstacles to them. In the end, in a short period of time, these troops had already arrived at the border between the forces that Luo Fan had conquered and each of their own forces. They had directly laid out an encirclement that had almost no flaws. This encirclement was so tight that even Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in admiration at the tacit understanding they displayed. The founders of these factions are indeed not simple to be able to cooperate with each other, so tacitly even without a guardian platform as a transit point. Luo Fan sensed the encirclement around him, and a strange smile appeared on his face. It must be known that the rulers of these factions were incomparably powerful, and few in this world could compare to them. However, their absolute cultivation level was only equivalent to that of a tribulation cultivator. They were not Luo Fan, nor were they true saints. Even so, there was a limit to how far their perception could extend between the heavens and the earth. There was a limit to how far their perception could extend, so naturally, the distance they could communicate with each other was also limited. In a situation where a single force could easily encompass multiple great heavens and earths, if the rulers of those forces wanted to contact the rulers of other forces within their own sphere of influence, it was obviously impossible for them to use the mysterious power contained within the protective platforms to connect with each other and form face-to-face communication like before the rebirth of the great heavens and earths. Under such circumstances, the only way they could communicate with each other was through guesswork. To be able to form such a strong tacit understanding through guesswork and form such a perfect defensive system to completely seal off Luo Fan's faction in the center, one could imagine how strong their tacit understanding was. It was no wonder that Luo Fan would sigh in admiration. However, although the encirclement formed by such tacit understanding was quite tight, in the end, it was still almost perfect. After all, there were still loopholes. To Luo Fan, these loopholes were as obvious as reading a book on a palm. With a single glance, he could see everything clearly, without missing a single detail. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. He raised his hand and tapped lightly, and issued the first order he had given in years. This order was passed down layer by layer, directly to the hands of all members of this faction, including the lowest soldiers and even the living beings that lived in this faction. As this order was passed down, the orders received by every living being would undergo subtle changes, and all sorts of subtle adjustments would occur according to their own circumstances. Chapter 2195. Luo Fan saw all of Shu Si's reactions. At that moment, he made a grabbing motion, and a speck of spiritual light escaped from the unimaginable chaos caused by Shu Si's self-destruction. It instantly traversed the endless void and appeared in front of him. This speck of spiritual light was extremely pure. It contained the purest essence of life. Apart from this essence, everything else, including memories, personality, and everything else that was given to a living being after birth, had completely disappeared. Looking at this speck of spiritual light, Luo Fan sighed and said, "Why is this necessary?" As he sighed, he casually tossed the speck of spiritual light into the void. It entered the reincarnation cycle that was already under Luo Fan's control and re-entered this world. It reincarnated into a living being and began a brand new journey in life. However, this time, it was a brand new life. Apart from that bit of essence, there was no longer any trace of Shu Si on it. Moreover, compared to Shu Si, who could still maintain her free thoughts and thoughts in Luo Fan's huge force that spanned the entire world, this brand new life had completely become a part of this force. Or rather, it had become a part of the endless living beings that worshipped Luo Fan as the new heavenly Tao of this world. At this moment, at a glance, the entire world seemed to be filled with unprecedented vitality. All the creatures in this world, and even all the matter, were operating according to some kind of extremely noble and powerful will, displaying the most positive effect it could have on this world, or in other words, on this huge force ruled by Luo Fan. However, if one looked deeper and observed carefully, one would find that this world had fallen into an indescribably rigid state. Everything in this world seemed to have been erased of all spiritual light and spiritual vigor. It had completely turned into a strange mechanical state. Every combination and every composition was completely in accordance with the requirements of this world as a whole. It was in accordance with the fundamental requirements of this huge force controlled by Luo Fan. As for the living beings' own wills, they had been completely wiped out. To a certain extent, such a world could already be considered a barren desert, a desert of the living beings' wills. Originally, in such an incomparably vast world, Luo Fan should have naturally given birth to a feeling of loneliness and solitude. However, at this moment, he was extremely calm. This loneliness and solitude did not appear in his heart at all. This situation seemed strange, but it was actually very normal. After all, to him, although this world was vast and rich, it was ultimately just a world born from the tribulations. No matter how many living beings there were, no matter how rich the wonders, to him, they were all his enemies and obstacles. As long as he could break through this world and break through the carrier of this tribulations, he would not frown at all even if he directly slaughtered the world and destroyed it. Under such circumstances, all he had to do was control all the wills in this world. What was that to him? Moreover, this control was not irreversible. If he wanted to, he could instantly return freedom to everything in this world. In the blink of an eye, he could restore this world to its original natural and lively state. With such confidence, how could he have any emotional fluctuations because of such a situation? With a thought, Luo Fan's spiritual light, doppelganger, slightly trembled and gradually dissipated. Then, a figure slowly walked out of the void. This figure was surrounded by endless mysteries. Just its appearance had already shaken the endless world and space-time, causing every inch of the sky to be drowned in rays of light. Endless celestial sounds and Sanskrit chants reverberated throughout the world. An incomparably sacred and noble feeling instantly filled the entire world. If the living beings in this part of the world still had their own consciousness, they would definitely be kneeling on the ground and cheering for the arrival of the most powerful being they could imagine. But obviously, this is not going to happen. As a result, apart from the strange phenomena, that naturally appeared in this world, there were no other changes that came from living beings. Instead, the entire world seemed exceptionally peaceful because of this. The figure that stepped out of the void was none other than Luo Fan's original body. At this moment, he slowly walked out of the barrier between reality and the other planes. The endless mysteries and principles that came from the great Tao of chaos that he had yet to digest were naturally released at this moment. They affected this part of the world and caused such a huge change in this part of the world. It gave rise to a might that even a true saint might not be able to compare to in regards to this. Luo Fan did not feel the slightest bit pleased. He only felt an indescribable sense of helplessness. This was because although the might brought about by this change was earth-shattering, it was not what he wanted, nor was it something that appeared under his control. All of this was completely caused by his inability to control the information and mysteries of the great Tao of chaos that was pouring into his body. The stronger this power was, the weaker his control over these principles and mysteries was. This meant that he was still far away from success. How could he be happy about this? Fortunately, his spirit light avatar had already gained complete control of this world and deeply imprinted his imprint into the grand Tao of chaos. This allowed him to rely on the pressure within the chaotic Tao to reduce the information that poured into his body to almost nothing. This was also why he dared to leave the barrier of that plane and appear in this plane. Compared to the spiritual light doppelganger that had severed its own spirituality, Luo Fan's main body spirituality wasn't damaged in the slightest. His comprehension, observation, and thinking abilities were many times stronger than the spiritual light doppelganger. After the spirit light, clone completely conquered this world through its own control and completely integrated the top and bottom worlds into one. It had most sense that it had fused with the chaotic Tao and become an extension of the chaotic Tao. In other words, it was the new heavenly Tao of this world. However, for Luo Fan's original body, he instantly saw a fact, a hope. One was the fact that he had already reached the pinnacle of this world. The other was the hope that he could transcend this world and truly break through this wave of tribulations. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and the chaotic Tao trembled slightly. Suddenly, endless information and mysteries gushed out from Luo Fan's body. This information and principles were invisible and could even be called an absolute illusion. From a fundamental point of view, it was an existence that did not exist. However, at this moment, they appeared in an unimaginable way, revealing a form that should not have existed. It seemed to be the world, but it also seemed to be spirit light, more like a kind of chaos, like fragments of space-time, like the shadows of living beings, and so on and so forth. It was almost a form of everything. Just these bodies alone already contained incredible power. They even directly disrupted the structure of the surrounding space-time and the structure of the rules and laws, causing the space-time within hundreds of millions of light years around Luo Fan's body to seem to be instantly shattered and then reconstructed in an extremely random manner. As the countless principles and mysteries were freed, the phenomena caused by Luo Fan gradually faded. The various rays of light and celestial music that covered the entire world gradually disappeared. In the end, when the area within hundreds of millions of light years around Luo Fan's body had turned into absolute chaos that was like paste, all the phenomena had completely disappeared. Luo Fan's body had also completely recovered, and it seemed as if nothing had happened. He was still the same as before. I've finally broken free. At this moment, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, but he felt unprecedentedly relaxed. At the very least, he had never felt so relaxed since he fell into the state of being bound by the great Tao of chaos more than 100 million years ago, unable to move or escape. With this opportunity to relax, he casually waved his hand, and the countless living beings that had died because he had released countless information that had disrupted space-time and the world naturally released a bit of light. Just like Shu Si, they entered the reincarnation cycle and began a new life journey. After doing all this, Luo Fan did not transcend this world as he had sensed earlier. Instead, he sat down cross-legged in the midst of the chaos. His body trembled, and he seemed to have fused with the void. Gradually, only a faintly discernible shadow of light remained where he was. At the same time, in the void where he was, crackling sounds could be heard. Crisp sounds constantly rang out from within his body. This kind of sound was like some kind of extremely tough object instantly collapsing under the impact of some kind of terrifying power. As the sound continued to ring, the illusory feeling in Luo Fan's body became more and more intense. Moreover, in that illusory feeling, there were traces of subtle aura that had never been there before emerging bit by bit. They constantly overlapped and fused, forming an incomparably strange aura. This extremely strange aura was so difficult to understand, and its internal composition was so complicated that it was indescribable. However, under the illumination of this aura, Luo Fan gave off a completely different feeling. It was as if he was gradually walking out of the illusion and becoming more and more real. At this moment, what he was doing was nothing else but taking advantage of the opportunity of becoming the new heavenly law of this world. He borrowed the power of the great Tao of chaos to communicate with the countless planes that he had yet to connect with reality. It must be known that back then, the heavenly law itself already had the ability to completely connect its corresponding existences in the various planes with the help of some kind of network. If Luo Fan had not used his own understanding of the changes in the various planes to break this connection by changing the structure of the old heavenly laws corresponding existences in the various planes, he might still be struggling with the old heavenly law now. It was clear that even the old heaven's way could instinctively achieve this under the situation where the controller had no knowledge of the planes. Now that Luo Fan, who had an extremely deep understanding of the mysteries between the planes, had obtained this special characteristic of the heaven's way, it was imaginable to what extent the power he could obtain would reach. At this moment, what Luo Fan was doing was the most basic manifestation of this power. Compared to the tens of thousands of years before he could connect a certain plane to the real world, now he only needed to think about it, and the power of the great Tao of chaos would naturally help him connect the barrier between a certain plane and the real world, allowing him to easily connect that plane to the real world. In this way, he could connect to dozens or even hundreds of planes in an instant. The efficiency was hundreds of millions of times greater than before. However, there were just too many planes. Even with this convenience, it was still an extremely long process for Luo Fan to completely connect the nearly limitless planes with the real world. Under such circumstances, time slowly passed. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. In the blink of an eye, another million years had passed. During these million years, the world was like a well-functioning machine, operating according to the various rules that Luo Fan had set back then. It formed the reincarnation of the world, the cycle of power, the cycle of time, and so on. During these million years, Luo Fan had been floating in his original position. Crackling sounds rang out from his body all the time. After a million years, it had almost become the scenery of this world. The space-time that had become chaotic because of the information, principles, and mysteries that flowed out from his body had unknowingly calmed down completely. It gradually stabilized into an indescribably mysterious scene, becoming a brand new natural landscape in this world. It was naturally incorporated into the operation of this force by the rules that Luo Fan had originally left behind, providing this world and this force with an endless supply of experts, making the strength of this world even more powerful. After a million years, the realistic feeling that emerged from Luo Fan's body had reached an unimaginable height. Now, no matter where he stood, his existence was like a crane among a flock of chickens. Even if he was among millions of figures that looked exactly the same as him, any ordinary person would still be able to discover his existence at first glance. This sense of existence was as if he had already become an existence that surpassed this level of the world, becoming an existence of a higher level. On this day, Luo Fan's heart shook. Just as he was about to connect to a level that could not be described with words and could not be summarized, he suddenly felt an indescribable sense of danger from the bottom of his heart. The moment this sense of danger appeared, his thoughts changed. The various changes in the endless levels gathered, allowing him to directly understand what was going on. With a thought, he suddenly used force to connect to that level. With this connection, he felt an unimaginable pressure shrouding his body. This pressure was so terrifying that after it appeared, it directly suppressed all the changes in his body and even suppressed all the activities of his mind. Moreover, this change was not limited to the reality level, but spread to many other levels. This included the many levels that he had connected to, which even he could not clearly describe with numbers. The pressure was so terrifying that it even caused the existences corresponding to his various planes to tremble continuously. Those that could make sounds kept making all sorts of sounds of shattering. Finally, it's time to make a breakthrough. Sure enough, this great tribulation won't let me achieve my goal so easily. But this is also an excellent opportunity. Luo Fan sighed inwardly in some indescribable, even deeper level of willpower than his thinking. As he lamented, a speck of light slowly emerged from his body. This spot of light completely ignored the supreme pressure that covered the corresponding existences of all levels. It continuously enlarged and strengthened until it gradually turned into a human figure. A figure that existed no matter what level it was. But no matter what level it was, its existence could not be grasped. As this light figure appeared, spots of light continuously spread in all directions in the endless levels, regardless of whether it was inside or outside the levels. As this spread, the remaining layers that would have taken an unknown amount of time to completely link up began to emit light at this moment. The light began to resonate with this human figure. And as the state of this human figure began to adjust, it gradually formed the same human figure in the various layers. Chapter 2197. Luo Fan was extremely shocked. He turned his head and looked around. There was only endless killing intent around him. Apart from the killing intent that came from the calamity, there was nothing else. As for the source of the voice, there was no trace of it at all. However, your foundation is quite solid. Your foundation to become a sage is not damaged. It seems that I will really have the opportunity to meet you in the future. At this moment, the voice that seemed to belong to the true sage spoke again. Following this, Luo Fan finally found a chance to speak. He said, "May I know where you are? Why don't you show yourself?" "Ha ha ha. Meet? You don't have the ability to meet me now. Cultivate well in the future. When you reach a certain level, you might be able to meet me." As the voice spoke, its voice became softer and softer. By the time the last word was spoken, it could no longer be heard. It seemed that the person had completely left at this moment. Don't have the ability? It seems that it really is a true sage. Luo Fan sighed. He did not know what he was thinking. He only felt that all sorts of indescribable emotions were emerging from the bottom of his heart, but he could not clearly distinguish them. He did not know when it started, but his calamity had already been linked to the true sage. From time to time, a true sage would come and interfere, either to test him or to give him preferential treatment. Although he had to take a risk every time, he also had a clearer understanding of how powerful a true sage was. The heaven's way of heaven and earth that had almost tortured him was actually just a little preferential treatment that the true sage had left for him. He thought that he was a genius who had obtained inspiration from the heaven's way of heaven and earth and obtained the opportunity to fight against the chaos way of heaven and earth. However, it was actually just the original arrangement of the true sage. The feeling of being trapped, no matter how hard he struggled, was really uncomfortable. After a while, the surrounding endless killing intent gradually surged. It seemed that another attack was about to be launched. Luo Fan then sighed. His body shook and an indescribable mysterious light began to be released from his body. It began to gradually stir the surrounding killing intent, and gradually caused the surrounding killing intent to take on all sorts of strange forms. That baleful aura was not the baleful aura of an ordinary world. Instead, it came from the depths of the primal chaos. It was a kind of baleful aura produced by the great calamity triggered by his ability. It contained boundless, inconceivable profundities and contained the might to destroy the world and annihilate all existences. In the past, it would have been almost impossible for Luo Fan to stir this kind of murderous aura. However, it was a natural ability for him now. At this moment, the existences corresponding to him in all levels had completely disappeared. The essence of his existence was nothing more than an abstraction from various planes. It was a wonderful state that originated from and transcended each plane. Such a person could be said to be non-existent in any plane. And under such circumstances, to the Great Tribulation, or perhaps to the other great tribulations that would occur more often in the future, his essence would still remain the same. He could still be targeted and attacked. However, for the fifth great calamity, it was the same as for all the other levels. It was as if it did not exist. In this way, he could be said to have transcended the fifth great calamity. Originally, under normal circumstances, the fifth great calamity should have regarded him as having failed to overcome the tribulation and disappeared. However, he did not die in the end. His essence still existed after all. Even if he could not be discovered, the fifth great calamity could still vaguely sense that he was still alive. Because of this, the fifth great calamity appeared in such a strange state. Luo Fan was clearly already here, and his existence could not be sensed, but he did not disappear. He continued to wander around aimlessly, looking for a new direction to evolve in. It was also because the ominous aura had become aimless at this moment that Luo Fan and Shu only needed to slightly reveal their presence, and it would be enough for them to control the ominous aura as they wished. At this moment, the baleful aura became more and more chaotic under his control. Chaotic vortexes continuously appeared at this moment, colliding and destroying each other. In the end, the essence of the baleful aura was continuously consumed in this process. In the end, after an unknown period of time, when the entire boundless baleful aura had fallen into an internal conflict, a strange fluctuation suddenly appeared in the surrounding boundless baleful aura. This fluctuation was so mysterious that it was like the first sound that was born after the creation of the world. It instantly swept away all the baleful aura and shook all the conflicts between the baleful aura. Following that, cracks appeared in the boundless baleful aura, directly cutting it open. The boundless baleful aura gradually seeped into the cracks in the process, becoming thinner and smaller. This kind of crack was extremely strange. It was not a crack in space, nor was it a crack in time. Instead, it was something similar to a crack in the plane. Outside this crack seemed to be a state of chaos, but it also seemed to be a mysterious existence that surpassed the endless plane. In it, Luo Fan could clearly sense the indescribable terror. It was as if even if he entered it, he would not be able to come out and would be devoured completely. This kind of baleful aura that came from the great calamity formed its own space-time. As long as the baleful aura existed, there would be space-time, energy, and matter. However, when the baleful aura disappeared, it was not just the extremely sinister energy that disappeared, but also the space-time and matter contained in the baleful aura itself. Therefore, after the baleful aura disappeared, it did not leave behind any void, nor did it leave behind any traces. It was as if everything had already disappeared. In the end, when all the cracks had devoured all the baleful aura, they directly came to Luo Fan's side and smashed towards him. Luo Fan's body shook and rushed upwards. It was as if his body had smashed through an invisible barrier and arrived in an indescribable void. When Luo Fan appeared in this void, it was in a completely cold state. It was as if there was no time, space, matter, or energy there. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but frown. This situation was not what he had expected. After all, What he had done before was clearly to pass all the tests of the fifth tribulation, and he could be considered to have passed the tribulation successfully. In this case, after he broke through the barrier, what appeared should be the third level of the road to Down Master. All kinds of complicated thoughts emerged in Luo Fan's mind at this moment, making him feel a long-lost feeling of confusion. Suddenly, he lowered his head and looked at his own body. He came to a sudden realization and understood what was going on. He couldn't help but burst into laughter. So that's how it is. I almost forgot. As he spoke, the corresponding existences in the various layers began to emerge out of thin air at an unimaginable speed and gradually restored to an abstract appearance like the figure of light he was now. It seemed that not only had he completely recovered, but he had also gone one step further. The changes in all these layers also included the reality, and this was also the easiest level to see and understand. It looked as if a human figure was gradually condensing from nothingness onto the light figure. In just a few breaths, it had completely turned into a solid entity, and it was a real entity that surpassed all reality. With the appearance of this solid, the body of Luo Fan, the figure of light, began to gradually collapse, turning into specks of light, and gradually disappeared in the void. Among them, the corresponding existences in each layer received a speck of light and directly integrated it into the deepest part of their bodies, including their bodies in the reality. This change was extremely fast. It looked as if the figure of light collapsed and dissipated, and Luo Fan's body in the reality had already woken up. With this change, the endless void around him began to produce endless rays of light out of thin air. These rays of light were so mysterious and so incredible. After their appearance, Luo Fan's corresponding existences in each layer were indescribably nourished. Endless feelings of comfort continuously poured into his body, making him feel that his understanding of heaven and earth, his understanding of the chaos, and his grasp of the worldview were constantly strengthened. This wonderful feeling made him forget the passage of time in a trance. After an unknown period of time, when Luo Fan suddenly regained his senses, he discovered that he was no longer in the void that was filled with rays of light. Instead, he had appeared in a place that he was extremely familiar with. He appeared in the third layer of the road to Down Master, and was gradually moving away from the third layer, beginning to enter a state of a new level with a slight feeling in his heart. He understood that he had really passed through the fifth major tribulation. He was already one step closer to becoming a true saint. After passing through the fifth major tribulation, his cultivation realm and the power of his divine abilities had improved tremendously compared to before. It could be said that if the current him encountered the him before he had passed the tribulation, he would not even need to move. Just a thought would be enough to easily erase him from the past. This kind of improvement almost exceeded any of the major tribulations that he had passed in the past. The reason for this was not only because of the basic benefits that he had obtained from passing the major tribulation, but also because of the power of the major tribulation. It was also because of the opportunity of the existence of a true saint in the major tribulation that allowed him to comprehend the mysteries that he should not have been able to comprehend in the major tribulation, the mysteries of all levels. It was because of this understanding that he had obtained such a huge improvement, allowing him to improve so many times in just one major tribulation. After understanding this, he also understood why he was in this state of ascending to a new level at this moment. This was because the third layer of the road to Down Master could no longer accommodate him, and had even reached the point where he had to be forcefully sent away. With a slight thought, he lifted his eyes and swept his gaze across the entire third layer of the road to Down Master. Everything in the third layer was no different from before. Clearly, although it had been hundreds of millions of years since he had entered the fifth Great Tribulation, it had only been a few years for the third level of the Tao Sovereign Path. I originally thought it was unfathomable, but now it seems that it's nothing more than this. Then he sighed in his heart. As a result, everything on the third level of the Tao Master's path was not worth mentioning in his eyes. It didn't matter if it was the foundation of sainthood, the various holy lands for cultivation, or the many hidden experts. They were all existences that he could crush at any time. Not to mention that it was unfathomable. It was far inferior to the pseudo-heavenly way and heavenly way that he had encountered in the major tribulation. Sighing inwardly, Luo Fan's figure flew higher and higher. In the blink of an eye, he had already broken through an invisible barrier and stepped into a new level, the fourth layer of the road to Tao Master. The moment he stepped into the fourth layer, he felt an endless pressure acting on his body. This pressure was as terrifying as the state of chaos. In an instant, it had already easily crushed his incomparably terrifying body, which he felt could even easily crush all living beings in the third layer of the road to Tao Master. The process was so straightforward that he couldn't even react for a moment. He didn't know what was going on. Immediately after, before he could activate the connection between the other planes and this plane of reality to restore his body, the pressure had already turned slightly and directly reconstructed his body, allowing his body to completely return to its original appearance. Then, as soon as his body was restored, the pressure was produced again and completely crushed his body, and so on, one after another, and again and again. All the changes were linked together, causing Luo Fan to directly fall into an eternal hell of death and rebirth. Could it be the baptism before entering the fourth layer? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat as this thought emerged in his mind. If it was in the past, he could only struggle to support his own will to resist the endless pain brought by death and rebirth, and then use the gap between the countless times of death and rebirth to observe the surroundings bit by bit, and finally reconstruct the overall situation to achieve the goal of understanding what was going on. However, it was obvious that the current him could even transcend the restrictions of the various layers. So how could he still be the same as before? At this moment, with just a thought, he had a kind of perspective brought by the figure of light that had previously transcended the various layers. With just a glance, everything where he was had already entered his eyes. This place was a universe with countless stars. In this universe, apart from the stars that hung in the depths of the universe, there was only endless pitch-black darkness. This pitch black seemed to be a void, but it was filled with an indescribably terrifying power. It was a terrifying power that contained the basic existences of time, space, and matter. This power might not be comparable to the chaotic state in terms of level, and it might not even be comparable to the terrifying ominous aura that Luo Fan had encountered in the Great Calamity. However, it had an unimaginable effect on all matter and power. The moment Luo Fan entered it, he was naturally crushed by this power. Everything in his body, including all the power and energy contained in his body, and even his life origin, was completely crushed in this process. However, after this power crushed his body, it immediately resonated with his life origin, and it naturally began to reconstruct his body and everything in accordance with his life origin, returning him a complete body. At the same time, the pitch-black power continued to penetrate his body and his life essence. It wanted to change his body and his life essence. This change was extremely slow and difficult. If it wasn't for Luo Fan's detached perspective that allowed him to sense even the slightest changes, he would have needed at least hundreds of millions of times to sense the existence of this change, just by relying on the changes of death and rebirth. It's not a baptism, but a test. At this moment, Luo Fan already understood in his heart. This power's crushing and reconstructing of his body was not a baptism at all, but a test to see if he had the qualifications to survive at this level. If he could not complete the test, he would eventually die countless times and be devoured by the endless pitch-black power around him. He would become a part of this pitch-black power and become the test that other living beings would encounter after entering this place. Only if he could withstand this test and pass this test would he be able to break free from the influence of this power and exist freely on the fourth level. He would also be able to cultivate freely, find a direction to advance, and search for cultivation resources. After understanding this, it was obvious what he had to do. At that moment, his heart trembled slightly. Rays of light were released from his life origin and continuously linked up around his body. Not long after, they formed a human-shaped barrier of light that completely enveloped his body, completely isolating him from the pitch-black power around him. Chapter 2198. All the light in this layer of light curtain was not ordinary power, but the ability of perception. These perception abilities were constantly connected to the surface of his body at this time, constantly complementing each other and even faintly transforming each other. In the end, this body was formed, but it naturally emitted an aura that belonged to the world of laws. Moreover, it was an aura that was millions of times stronger than the general world of laws. Under this aura, the surrounding pitch-black energy was like seawater smashing onto a reef, violently shattering, turning into endless fragments that shot in all directions, directly merging into the endless darkness around him, and disappeared without a trace. With this change, the continuous cycle of collapse and rebirth on Luo Fan's body due to the crushing of the endless power around him was directly interrupted. His body completely recovered to its peak state, and he stood there quietly as if nothing had happened. At this point, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. He looked around, and the surrounding scene had undergone some subtle changes. In the endless darkness, there were faint black shadows constantly emerging and constantly twisting around his body. They constantly intertwined, as if they were going to form a special structure. Vaguely, there were strands of information constantly being transmitted to him from the combination of the black shadows. Bit by bit, it constantly seeped into his mind, making him understand many things in a trance. With this understanding, he suddenly raised his hand and waved it. The light barrier that formed on the surface of his body suddenly expanded, and in the process, it began to frantically devour the endless pitch-black power around him, devouring the endless black shadows within it. The essence of this pitch-black energy was actually a kind of power similar to the state of chaos. But for some reason, it underwent all kinds of unimaginable changes and finally turned into this pitch-black state. At this moment, when these energies were swallowed by the light curtain, they naturally began to decompose, transform, and attach themselves to the light curtain. In the end, the scene inside the light curtain gradually changed, causing various indescribable lights and shadows to appear inside the light curtain. Gradually, it was divided into different parts of the world, space-time, and worlds. It was as if an incomparably vast group of worlds had suddenly appeared out of nowhere around him. At the moment this group of worlds was born, Luo Fan faintly felt that through some extremely mysterious way, countless worlds were entering this group of worlds in some form, becoming a part of this group of worlds. Those worlds, each one of them, made Luo Fan feel extremely familiar. Each of these worlds was previously created by Luo Fan, and he did not know whether they existed or not. Among them was the eternal world that he had created in the second level of the road to Tao Master, as well as the billions of worlds inside the eternal world. It also included the countless worlds that were born and destroyed in any of his previous battles. It even included the perfect world that he had created in the universe on Earth, which had survived several great tribulations of heaven and earth, and a huge number of major, medium-sized, and minor kiliocosms in the Void Wuji Palace that he had built in the Primordial world. All of these, at this time, were directly thrown into this group of worlds in a way that he could not understand, becoming a part of this group of worlds, and becoming the foundation that supported the existence of this group of worlds. Of course, this way of entering did not directly cross the level of the road to Tao Master, cross heaven and earth, cross time, and even cross the state of chaos to be transferred here. Instead, it was like a space-time connection, connecting the countless worlds, and space-time through a kind of space-time connection, so that they could join this group of worlds. It was as if the pitch-black power had formed a transit connection across time, space, and the state of chaos. Or in other words, a kind of link, the number of space-times, worlds, and worlds that Luo Fan had created in the past was almost beyond the limit of what could be described by numbers. Moreover, at this time, The pitch-black power was constantly generating more and more space-times and worlds according to the mystery of the divine sense, which caused the group of worlds around Luo Fan to grow at an almost unimaginable speed. In Luo Fan's own view, in just a few short breaths, these worlds had already become an incomparably huge nebula, emitting a light that even shocked all the cultivators in this part of the world. The light spread in all directions, showing his existence to the entire fourth level of the road to Tao Master. Who was this big shot? On a star extremely far away, there was a cultivator floating in the center of a small group of worlds, looking at the sun that was growing at an unimaginable speed in the distance with a shocked expression on his face. The cultivator floated in the center of the group of worlds, surrounded by densely packed worlds that constantly rotated around him. Among these worlds, there were countless major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor kiliocosms, but there were only a few worlds that surpassed these levels. And the worlds that surpassed the major kiliocosms were much smaller than any of the worlds in Luo Fan's eternal world. However, even so, the cultivator was already like a god of creation here. His sitting cross-legged figure was like a supreme existence that could suppress the heavens and worlds. Every breath he took seemed to be able to trigger an endless tide of energy and could trigger an endless surge of terrifying power. And this was the scene that could be seen from within the group of worlds. If one were to look at it from outside the world group, it would actually look like a star, a tiny star that could only emit a faint light in the boundless darkness. In this way, the light spot where Luo Fan was in the distance was getting bigger and brighter, and it looked like a huge sun. Just by looking at it, one could tell how vast the group of worlds was and how powerful and incredible the existence that had caused this group of worlds to be born was. It was no wonder that the cultivator in front of him was so shocked. At this moment, almost all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path were as shocked as this cultivator was. Almost all the cultivators who discovered that a new sun had been born where Luo Fan was that were shocked by the aptitude and potential that Luo Fan had displayed, and all sorts of indescribable thoughts ran through their minds. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to everything that had happened to him. At this moment, his mind had completely integrated into the whole group of worlds, and he was carefully experiencing every bit of strengthening, growth, and improvement of this group of worlds. The appearance of every world, every heaven and earth, and every space-time in the group of worlds triggered a certain memory from deep within his memory to resurface. The various scenes and experiences of when he had first opened up that world reappeared in his mind with the appearance of this world, and they occupied his mind once again. In a trance, he felt that he had been divided into hundreds of millions of parts, and he was reliving his entire life and all his experiences. An indescribable and subtle feeling gradually emerged from the bottom of his heart. Looking at it now, the worlds that he had opened up back then, including the eternal world that he had opened up on the second level of the Tao Master's path, seemed so rough and imperfect. However, when he recalled the various memories of when he had first opened up the world, he had a different kind of feeling. It was as if his mind had been reinforced in the process, and even his will seemed to have been reborn. With the passing of time, the survival of living beings would inevitably change every second and minute. No matter how strong-willed or stubborn a living being was, it was bound to gradually change with the passage of time. If enough time passed, that living being might even completely change into another living being. For example, at this moment, although Luo Fan had already implemented his will into everything through countless times of cultivation, and he had absolute confidence that he would still be himself no matter how time passed, he still found that he had changed a lot compared to the past when he recalled the various experiences that he had experienced in the past. Some of these changes were in accordance with his mind and his will, while some were completely distorted by the outside world and influenced by external forces. All of this, if it was in the past, he would not have been able to detect it at all. However, at this time, under the stimulation of the memories that emerged in his mind out of thin air along with the worlds, he was able to clearly grasp this change. The subtle distortions in his mind that he had not been able to detect before were naturally corrected. This state was the rebirth. Under this rebirth, Luo Fan only felt that his mind became clearer and clearer, and everything that he saw seemed to become more and more transparent. In a trance, he seemed to have come into contact with an indescribable realm. With the appearance of this change, his whole body suddenly shook, and in an instant his body exploded. Even the existences that corresponded to him in the various levels collapsed at this time, directly turning into powder and disappearing without a trace. Fortunately, he had actually already surpassed the limits of the various levels. At this moment, countless light spots condensed in the void out of thin air and transformed into his figure, which saved him from dying a violent death. I've come into contact with the unbearable profundity again. After this light appeared, Luo Fan sighed, and his expression was filled with helplessness. He could not be more clear about the change in that instant just now. It was clearly similar to the chaotic grand Tao he encountered during the fifth tribulation. Because the profundities contained within the existence he came into contact with had already far exceeded the limits he could endure, it caused his body and all other existences on other planes to be unable to endure the profundities within it, and they exploded and transformed into powder. Moreover, the existence that he came into contact with just now was even more terrifying than the chaotic Tao that he encountered in the fifth Great Tribulation. The moment he came into contact with the chaotic Tao, he could feel endless information and profundity pouring into his body. He could also feel how the information and profundity impacted his mind, his body, his power, and even the corresponding existences on other levels. Just now, he had only slightly sensed the mysterious and inexplicable existence, and before he could even react, his body and the corresponding existences on all levels had completely collapsed. This difference was so great that he did not even dare to think about it. Fortunately, this kind of damage was nothing to him at the moment. With just a slight movement of his heart, Luo Fan's corresponding existence began to gradually materialize from the illusory to the real, gradually emerging in the various layers. As the existences that corresponded to him in all levels reappeared, the light figure collapsed again and entered the countless levels, fusing with the existences that corresponded to him. After this change, Luo Fan's body trembled in reality, and he had already recovered. At a glance, it seemed that nothing had happened to him, and everything seemed to be the same as before. It's a pity that my level is still too low. Otherwise, I might have been able to step into an unimaginable level in one fell swoop. Looking at the endless world around him that was almost complete, Luo Fan could not help but show an inexplicable helplessness on his face. At this moment, the endless pitch-black power around him was still constantly pouring into the clusters of worlds around his body, giving birth to one world after another. From the outside, it looked as if the sun where he was constantly expanding, and its radiance was also constantly increasing. Originally, before he came into contact with that indescribable realm, there were still stars that were comparable to it in the boundless fourth level of the Tao Master's path, which was the clusters of worlds, even though the sun was huge and bright. However, as he recovered from his previous state, the light of the sun suddenly took a big leap, and finally surpassed all the clusters of worlds on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It seemed to have truly turned into the sun of the entire fourth level, providing the entire fourth level with endless light and heat, giving the entire fourth level a brightness that had never been seen before because of its existence. It was as if the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had suddenly gone from night to day. And all these changes only lasted for a short while. Before the many cultivators could express their shock, the pitch-black power that filled the endless clusters of worlds began to surge, completely cutting off the extraordinary light, causing the entire fourth level to return to its original pitch-black appearance.